One. All right, everybody. Welcome to week 6 of Reading Being in Time. This is chapter 5, part A. Chapter 5, part A is a part that I told you all is very juicy, but I didn't really. I said it's chapter 5, and so I hate to break it to you all, but the juicy part's actually part B. It's the second part of chapter 5. Chapter A is just like the most intensely boring or confusing. I don't want to say boring because for me it's not boring at all, but it is potentially the most confusing and difficult foreplay to the juicy part that you'll ever encounter. And I mean, that really speaks to his goals here, honestly. Let's just read this passage here that I've got up on the screen from page 188. Has not Dasein's being become more enigmatical now that we have explicated the existential constitution of the being of the there in the sense of throne projection? ... So I skip a bunch, and then we must first let the full enigmatical character of this being emerge, even if all we can do is to come to a genuine breakdown over its solution and to formulate anew the question about the being of throne projective being in the world. I emphasized enigmatical twice and the word breakdown. Enigmatic means, from the Google dictionary, difficult to interpret or understand, mysterious, puzzling, hard to understand. Remember, the beginning of this book starts with Socrates saying, "Are we not now perplexed? We thought that we know what being means. Now we're all confused. Now we're not so sure that we know what we're talking about." Actually, I'll just read it from the very beginning of the introduction. "For manifestly, you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed." I think that he wants us to be perplexed at this point because what he's trying to do is so counter to what we take for granted. If he is succeeding, then we are confused. Now, part of our confusion comes from just interpretation, translation. Words like whither and thither and yonder don't help. And that's not actually his goal. A word like hither, thither, or yonder is like Old English. It's like Shakespeare. It's like King James Bible. This is not in any way, shape, or form what kind of language I think he would have wanted to be translated into. He would have wanted to be translated into sort of standard, vulgar English, not Shakespearean, ancient English, right? So, you'll just have to bear with him. It's not his fault that someone took his peasant prose and then translated that into Shakespeareanese. But it's also confusing because it runs counter to our common sense, right? It runs counter to the entire history of the tradition of philosophy. And it's a tradition that he assumes that you know. And I know for a fact that at least a couple of you were reading this and like, because you're kind of outside of the history of philosophy, there's parts here where you're kind of just like, okay, and you're not exactly sure what he's getting at. I'll try to get into a little bit of that, but there is a lot here that you'll just kind of have to bear with. And so thank you for your patience in that regard. And I don't know, I think you basically all deserve some kind of like a medal for making it this far. Right? You've officially made it further into this text than a lot of people ever do. And even if you failed to finish this week's reading, you probably got something from it that you don't even realize. And it's something that's going to take ill shape in the future. And then you'll end up walking in and thinking that you had some great, profound realization. And then later on, you'll realize, oh, that was actually just like a watered down like version of kind of where Heidegger was going when I stopped reading him. And so that's why you really want to come back to this in the future. But Yeah, that's my little reading pep talk, is just to say you've made it further than a lot of people do. You're on a marathon stretch right now. A lot of people are sitting on their couches, watching Netflix, jacking off, playing with their sex toys, whatever they do, and then eating Cheetos and texting people habitually every time they get distracted. And some people said, no, I'm going to go do a marathon. And you guys are the ones who said, I'm going to go do a marathon. Now, some people are doing a real marathon, like Anne's sister was just doing like a marathon, which is amazing and speaks to the fact that she is a doer. But you are all also doers in this sense, that you've taken on something as difficult as James Joyce's Ulysses, like as much like a pinnacle of something that people like see. It's like, oh, that's a mountain that I might someday climb. You will meet people who think that you deserve a doctorate just for getting through being in time and being able to write like a basic paper on it. I met someone who told me, no, you should get a doctorate just for the fact that you were able to get published writing about being in time in a peer-reviewed journal, says you should probably get a doctorate, because that means that you actually worked through it, tarried with it, struggled, understood something from it, and it's just like a lifelong achievement. And some of you probably put off that, the obtainment of that achievement or the undertaking of this task. You put it off for a long time. And then you finally said, I'm going to do it summer 2023. And so thank you. Other people said, hey, looks like a great thing to do. It wasn't even like this huge bucket list item for you yet. It wasn't super invested with this like charge of, I don't know, some kind of aura that texts like this get around them. But the thing about a book like James Joyce's Ulysses, it's going to help you think about language. It's going to help you think about meaning. It's going to help you think about a lot of things. But it is not attempting to be very, very precise in what it says. It is not attempting to take you step by step into or out of a cave that is going to forever change how you see everything. It takes you through a lot of different perspectives. It takes you through a lot of different things. But being in time, I do think it's on a very, very special sort of pedestal. And this is obviously my own bias, but I think that my bias is based in something real. And that something real is the fact that it forever changes anyone who really gives it a serious engagement. Someone like Theodor Adorno doesn't count as someone who ever gave it a serious engagement, because he never treated Heidegger like he could be trusted, right? Someone like Marcuse did, to some extent. Someone like Jaspers did, to some extent. Someone like Arendt did, to a pretty extreme extent. And of course, they all become his critics eventually. But there's a world of difference between the critique of someone who said, all right, I'll be duped by the master and assume that I can trust him, and assume that he's not just a philosopher in a line of philosophers, but he's kind of like how Dugan said, you kind of have to think of him, which is like the last philosopher, the greatest philosopher, the philosopher who's here to show you why the history of philosophy's failed. And the sun is going down, and there's going to be a new era of being. We're just not there yet. Or epoch in that case. I don't think Adorno ever tarried with it in that way. So, to the people who are watching this after the fact, who didn't watch it live, including Nick Casalucci, who's currently dealing with his lost cell phone and just getting back to Philly because he was all over Italy and Germany, and now he's back in the States, but he lost his cell phone in the travels, and so he's got a lot of crap to deal with. So, life happens, and we understand. But to people like Nick, or people who are watching this after the fact, There's no such thing as after the fact. I've always got office hours coming up. You're always able to come with your questions from this text to my office hours. For instance, I've got office hours next week on July 11th, and I'll have office hours on July 18th as well. So if you've done a reading reflection, or if you have a bunch of questions or any kind of pressing question, or if you're struggling with a passage in particular, come to office hours. Let's deal with it. That's where the students who aren't just chasing A's go. I mean, students who are chasing A's do sit in the front of the class, and they do go to office hours. But if you're also just genuinely trying to understand a text like this, then you'll want to take advantage of office hours. Office hours is something that I've lumped in with other events. Christopher was the first person from this course to attend office hours. So congratulations to Christopher. And because he came to that event, he ended up being there for a bunch of other stuff that went down. And that's the thing, is office hours doesn't just ever happen in isolation. I do office hours, and then I do other things. And so on the 11th of July 2023, a couple of things that will be happening. There will be a discussion about the film club at Theory Underground. There will be a Timenergy lecture. There will be a presentation from Andrew, aka Big Signorelli on Instagram, or Andrew from the Vanishing Mediators channel. He's a fellow traveler. Andrew will be giving a talk on therapism, his critique of therapism using Lacan. He'll be critiquing people like Jordan Peterson and Gabriel Mate. Really, like, that's left and right versions of the current therapeutic discourse. And then there will also be, before the office hours on the 11th, some multilingualism. Okay, I've got multilingualist sessions. I'm not going to even tell you what language it is, because it doesn't ultimately matter. If you're trying to learn this one language and then I told you it wasn't that language, then you'd be like, oh, well, I don't care about going at that time. Well, then that's not the point. Obviously, all the multilingualist events that I'm doing are languages that long-term I want to learn. But the goal of these multilingual events is to get outside of English. Okay, so for someone like Sue, or for someone like Ahmed, you will spend a lot of time outside of English. So congratulations. But for everybody else in here, I'm guessing they spend a lot of time in English. And so getting outside of it and not sort of being in reference to it is a sort of practice, probably more important than meditation. Probably more important than a lot of the things that are currently celebrated as sort of fad diet practices that we're supposed to adopt into our lifestyles. So basically what that will look like is we'll just do drills, where the real goal is to read and practice with our mouths, making new sounds. And then we will do a thing where we do a little bit towards the end on, how does it work, Anne? Does it go, is it vocabulary? No, pronunciation is first, right? It goes pronunciation, vocabulary, and then translation, which is always interpretation. It's never neutral, right? And so the goal is to focus on pronunciation, though, and let vocab kind of come in afterwards. And it's more about, instead of just like, oh, this is the meaning of that word, now I can understand the sentence, it's more about like, yeah, but how do you interpret? And how do you translate? And how do you learn to look things up? For instance, in the last week, I've been doing a lot of going through Being in Time in original German. Okay? I'm actually able to read sentences in that thing now. That means that my Duolingo over the last few years has actually gotten me to a point where, yeah, I can kind of understand German grammar. I haven't memorized, I haven't been taught in a schooled fashion, but I have a gut sense for the grammar in certain cases where it's like, oh yeah, I get it. I get what's going on here. So anyway, there'll be an email. You don't have to make notes about this. There'll be an email going out very soon about the stuff going down on July 11th. July 18th is going to be a rinse and repeat. It's basically the exact same thing, except that there will be a panel on hardcore theory and a panel on hip-hop theory. Basically, I'm bringing a bunch of fellow travelers who come from underground music scenes, or artistic creation, into a conversation about the recent article that I just put out on how the emerging theory scene online is similar to music scenes in the past. There's good things about that, but also if that's all it is, then we're wasting our time. We want it to be more than just a scene, and so then we have to ask ourselves, what are the conditions for turning what's currently just a scene, some mode of consumption you're engaged in on your phone, turning that into a robust, dynamic, intellectual milieu capable of giving birth to movements, giving birth to thinkers, giving birth to maybe even activists who are worth a shit. That'd be cool. So, you'll get an email about that soon. And with that said, I want to ask everybody if you have any questions about the office hours events or anything else that I've said so far before I kind of talk about the assignment you all just did. Nothing.
May I know how long and when are the office hours?
Perfect. So for right now, I'll just give you the Eastern time zone, which I'm not in, but it's a good standard, I guess, in the United States at least, and you can measure against it. But the where did I just had it right in front of me. Oh, it's right here. So office hours will basically be an hour from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. On both the 11th and the 18th. And I'm saying 1 p.m. Eastern time, which is going to be super late for you, Sue. Probably. I don't know. Is that too late? Oh, you're muted.
I don't know. I have to check, and I just said to.
You're in Hong Kong, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Dave, another question about it, because I might have class during the same time for both the 11th and the 18th. Can there be an alternate arrangement or something?
For office hours?
Yeah.
Yeah, message me a couple other windows that would work on those same days, and like windows of time that would work for you, and we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So why am I typing 10? I meant to 12 p.m. No, 1 p.m. Eastern time is 1 a.m. Your time there, Sue. All right. But I'm trying to do this in a way so that people who are going through this course, feeling like they're doing it alone, know that they're not. That I'm there every week. The goal is to be there every week, so you'll always be able to come with your weekly questions and reflections. And if you do a reading reflection in the forum after the fact, and you let me know that you'll come to the office hours, I'll read your reflection before you even come. And we might even read it during office hours together and go over it. But it's just a way to make these not feel like they're dead after the fact. I want people to be able to kind of keep engaged. And I think Christopher got a lot out of it. And he was actually present for the critical media theory reflections that we did. It was an exercise, a lot of fun. It's something that Anne and Nance both took charge in leading. So I can't really even take much credit for that one. That's all on them, and they did a great job. So the assignment that I just had everybody do was to go through chapter 3, mostly, part A, mostly, and to find every instance of the words, or not to find every instance, but just to track down the meaning of involvement, for the sake of which, in order to, significance, referential totality, assignment, and with which. And then to put those onto a piece of paper in relation to one another, and to give specific quotation marks, references to specific quotes to back up the claim that something is in a specific relation to something else. So for instance, if the for the sake of which is grounded in the involvement, that means the involvement comes first. So you'd want the arrow going from involvement to for the sake of which, right? Or would you point the arrow the other direction? You kind of have to describe it with your own words, so for instance, for the sake of which is in reference to an involvement, right? But where does the in order to go? Where does the with which go? There should be a whole chain here, right? And so what I want people who are watching this after the fact to do is pause it and go do that for 10 minutes. If you want to do it with someone else who's currently reading this text, you can just keep watching right now and then try to do this assignment with them later. What I'm hoping everybody will do is actually draw out your own picture, use your own quotes, and share that picture into the forum and just call it, maybe we'll have to start a specific post. I will start the post. We got to do it that way, because if any one of you started the post and then you deleted your account after the fact, the whole thread gets nuked and all of the replies get disappeared. So I will start the post saying, please share your drawings of involvement for the sake of which, in order to, etc. And then please just all share your pictures in there. But now that we've done that, could one person from each group share how that went? And I'm going to call on Anne and Nance, whichever one of you wants to go first.
Yeah, I can start. We really focused on the first couple pages of section 118, which was really just touching on assignment, involvement, and for the sake of which. Let me go back to that part. Yeah, and so we didn't quite get to all of the other words. We probably could have used an hour to do this. But yeah, we were kind of trying to work out what exactly involvement is, like the sentence down in the middle of page 116. Whenever something ready to hand has an involvement with it, what involvement this is has in each case been outlined in advance in terms of the totality of such involvements. In a workshop, for example, the totality of involvements, which is constitutive for the ready to hand in its readiness to hand, is earlier than any single item of equipment. So we were kind of trying to tarry with that particular sentence, that last one, and figure out like for the sake of which is, and where that fits into involvement, and like what exactly assignment means. Like so that sentence, for example, you have to understand what all of the possibilities are of something before you can know how you're going to use the ready to hand entity. And so I don't even really know if we necessarily got like an order to even those three things. We were just kind of still tarrying with the meaning of them, but that is what we did in our time.
Tight, yeah!
How about you, Nance? How did it go in your group?
Yeah, I think, again, given infinite time, we probably could have cooked up something awesome. We just kind of, I think we're just about to start hitting like a groove. Sue brought up on page 95, or was it 97? At the bottom of page 97, or in the final paragraph of 97, the in order to is a structure. There lies an assignment or reference of something to something. So yeah, we were just kind of trying to suss out what the in order to and for the sake of which, and kind of why they're different. One relies on an assignment and one is kind of relies on the referential totality. Yeah, I think thinking about it that way, trying to like graphically represent it in a way that tracks that you can come back to later. It's like double dipping. Like you're taking notes now and you're helping yourself, but you're also setting future me up to come back and be like, oh, okay, I get this. I don't have to spend a couple hours reacquainting myself with these terms. I can look and see. That's definitely a really cool exercise that I think I want to spend more time on for sure.
Awesome. And so, do any of you have any thoughts as to how this might change your note taking as you go forward? How any of this assignment might have given you ideas about your note taking or about your underlining?
I feel like because this is kind of my first time like reading something this difficult, some of these words that Heidegger's using in this particular way, in order to, for the sake of which, it's like my tendency is just to kind of read over them and think, oh, if I just keep reading, like maybe it'll eventually make sense. But it's like maybe those words, it's better to kind of track them and really try to keep track of how they're being used in relation to things that I already understand, rather than just being like, oh, okay, there was a lot of phrases I couldn't really place in this paragraph. I'm just going to keep going, but actually like try to tarry with them.
How about you, Ahmed?
Yeah, I mean, there's a tradition of sort of visual note taking when it comes to like older philosophy. And as someone who really does struggle with note taking, I think this actually might be a really good alternative, a good way to visualize literally what you're reading.
Awesome. And notice that it's not just pictures, it's the relations between the words that we're trying to track. And so you could take a bunch of different colored pens or highlighters and then use just the yellow one for the word significance through that whole section. And then just the blue one for the in order to through that whole section. Just the, you know what I mean? You could do something like that. You could also do what I suggested to Christopher when he was stumbling into, it was on this section, right, man? Yeah, and what I'd suggested was, you got to keep in mind, with all great thinkers, until analytic philosophy, great thinkers do not sit here and piece by piece, item by item, give you their definitions. Instead, they have like their sort of foreconception. Is that how we're saying it in this chapter? Let's see. Foreconception. So they've got their foreconception going in to what they're writing, and they're trying to flesh it out, right? They're trying to flesh out their understanding through an interpretation of their foreconception, and we'll get into all of these terms in a little bit. But the basic thing is, they have a lot of reasons, probably a couple decades of reasons, to be pretty sure that whatever it is that they're intervening in on is wrong, the field. And so they're not going to go with the definitions in the field. But they're also, because they have a foreconception that they're trying to flesh out, they're not going to just sit here and up front define everything, because they're still working it through. And these things are all kind of in relation to one another. They're kind of interdependent upon one another. And so the best way to get, say, a definition of an in order to is usually you see it, and then it's probably 2 pages later he says something more about it. And then a couple of pages later he says something more about it. And of course, in between those pages, there's a bunch of other stuff going on. But you can draw a square around the specific term that you're tracking, and then in the margin beside that, write the page number for every other time he's giving a good characterization or usage of that term. So what that ends up looking like is having, a bunch of page numbers beside a word. And like if I'm trying to find an example in my own text here in front of me. I should have had one ready to hand. But let's see. I did it on page 154 in the middle. I have references to page, if my handwriting can be trusted, 110 and 121, but my handwriting can barely be trusted in this sense. And that's part of the issue. You are writing these notes to your future self just as much as your current self. So when you're writing it in the moment, you underline something because you feel like, oh, underlining it in this situation actually helps me read it closer, right? And so there's a lot of that going on. But what we have to be remembering is you're not just a present self, you're presenting this to your future self. You're trying to leave marks here to help your future self not have to do as much work. On one page 60, talking about how Dasein is its own end, not just a tool, right? On 160, he says something about that. I relate that to 121 and 154, where he says basically the same thing. Right? And so there's these sort of things where it's like, maybe I'll want to write about that later. Maybe I'll want to argue with him about that later. Maybe I'll want to use what he did here to argue with someone else later because I think what he's getting at is something correct. Anyway, all of that amounts to setting yourself up to be something of a scholar, right? We all want to be at least some kind of a scholar. Unless you just want to be able to tell people, well, I read Being in Time. And then if the person you're talking to is smart and not easily impressed, then they'll probably say, what'd you get out of it? And then if you can't sit here and go, well, it's changed how I think about X, Y, and Z, and I'm still struggling with A, B, and C questions. If you can't do that, then, I mean, did you really read it? So the last part of my how to read sort of meta discourse that we've been doing, as well as the pep talk, is to say that somebody at Theory Underground messaged me. He has been reading this book with us, but he's not been doing the lectures. This is somebody who has been a fellow traveler of Theory Underground for quite a while. He's argued with me in the past, but always in a respectful way, and always kind of like taking his, he'll tell me what he thinks, I'll tell him what I think, and then usually he'll go back to work on his own research for like 6 months to a year before we even talk again. And that's been going on now for years. He read Waypoint when it first came out and told me that calling Timenergy and existential in Heidegger's sense is not helpful, and that what he thinks is best is like the parts that I'm using for Marx. He just doesn't really get this Heidegger stuff. He thinks that it's probably not helpful. Well, now that he's reading Being in Time, he gets it. He gets it. And he's like, oh my fucking God. And it's like, all of a sudden, the concept is way more important to him. But I'm actually going to read a part of a message he sent me today. I'm going to keep his identity a secret for now, because I didn't get his permission to share all of this or whatever. But he says, Being in Time has challenged... Oh, first he said that the reason that he's not reading Being in Time, actually in this lecture course, it's not because of money. It's just because he wants to take his time with it, read it at his own pace, and he's giving himself like a lot of time because he's got it to actually work through this. And he doesn't want anyone else's interpretations getting involved. He just wants to go hard in Heidegger, and then watch the lectures, and then see what that does as far as quilting everything differently or showing him some other way of reading it. He says, I have been greatly enjoying reading Being in Time without any outside intervention. It has forced me to think harder, to develop my own, certainly flawed, idea of what Heidegger is saying. Being in Time has challenged my fundamental beliefs more than I could have ever imagined. Heidegger's critique of Descartes in chapter 3 was groundbreaking. That forced me to come up against the idea of scientism you've been talking about, and how science fundamentally sanitizes subject matters such that they become clean and definable. When Heidegger broke Descartes apart, piece by piece, I couldn't help but question everything I have been doing, everything I have been thinking. if you recall my question of the leap of faith towards a study of psychoanalysis, I was thinking back then from such a scientific viewpoint that I couldn't possibly understand why Lacan and the like were interesting or useful. Right? So I actually did a response to that with Nick and Andrew. The video is like called Leap of Faith or something like that. And I actually wrote an article called Taking the Theory Pill. And it's kind of like you kind of have to assume there must be a reason why people are reading this person, even though they're not doing things in the way that scientists do things. You kind of have to assume that, right? And I'd basically done this whole stream on that. Well, he says, this 5 to 10 page critique from Heidegger finally made me understand that it is only a leap of faith if you are totally embroiled in scientific sanitized thought. Otherwise, if one is interested in questions of being or a fuller understanding of life, humanity, and so on, there's no leap of faith there. It is just the next logical step. I only wish I had read this book 5 years ago. It would have saved me so much time. And I know something about his personal story. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he spent a lot of time studying physics and math, and he dropped out of grad school because he thought this is a bunch of bullshit. But he was still thinking, I'm wasting my time with all this continental philosophy stuff. I should be focusing on Marx. And he thought that a year ago. And I told him, I don't want to talk about Das Kapital with people who can't read Being and Time. I just don't want to have those conversations. So then he was like, fucking fine, I'll do it. Took on the challenge. And part of him was just craving reading philosophy anyway. He wanted to be disoriented anyway. He wanted to do something to genuinely change his situation. And yeah, this did it. And so I look forward to all of your kind of reflections going forward on ways that it might impact you. But that's only in chapter 3, part B, where he breaks Descartes down. And of course, he says that it happens within those 5 to 10 pages, but it doesn't really just happen in those 5 to 10 pages. Section A is where he sets up what we're actually always in with this for the sake of which, with these referential totalities, with the involvements, with the in order tos, where he sets up the structure of signification, which is to say meaning itself, right? By setting that up and then saying, but here's what Descartes says. Then he's able to just kind of go back to it and go, so doesn't make sense, does it? But without going through that work, if you just go straight to Descartes' Meditations and kind of get off into philosophizing from Descartes' Meditations, which is just some thought experiments very specific to his time, it'll end up changing how you see everything forever, for all time, if you don't have an antidote to it. And I personally don't even think that you can really get your antidote from it from someone like Lacan, because Lacan had to pass through Heidegger to get to where he got, right? And most people who get anything from Lacan did at least get something from Heidegger before they did so, or they just kind of accept on faith that he's into something, he's onto something, right? Maybe they read some McGowan, they listen to some Y theory, and then they go, there's something to this, man. Nobody else is talking about jouissance. I need to understand that better. And so then they go deep down Lacan rabbit hole and they realize this is transformed how I see things. I can't take these other ways of seeing seriously anymore. Yeah, sure. But guess what? Lacan never systematically deconstructs our fundamental modern assumptions. That's done here. I don't think you'll find any other place where it's done as thoroughly and carefully. So you're all doing probably the only thing that you should be doing. And that leads into a bigger question about this feeling of like obligation that we have to be wrestling with this text and doing our reading reflections and stuff. This sort of your big other, the ego ideal that you seek to please, like the gaze you want to gain recognition by. All of this stuff is saying, oh, you should be doing your homework very seriously. But we're mostly driven by drive, right? We're mostly driven by our super egoic drive to get jouissance from not doing what we're supposed to be doing according to the big other. So this is basic Žižekianism. I did a whole series on my channel. It's all free, where it's Lacan 101 and it's Žižek 101, and it's with Michael Downs, and it's really the basics for understanding what I'm kind of saying right now. But you don't need to know all of that. It'll be quilted later if you ever do go down that rabbit hole. But in simplistic language, without using any of the jargon, you really want to read this text in a deliberate way, take notes, and do your reading reflections. But there is this sort of secret enjoyment you get from undermining yourself and scrolling on your phone and looking at random stuff online. And so we're like, oh, we have ADHD. Okay, well, what we're talking about is the structural, psychological conditions of what's getting called ADHD for a lot of people, right? And that is this big split between what you want and what you enjoy. Okay. And I don't know yet how to hack that. Right? If you're feeling like you keep... Well, here's what I want. I want you to get your secret enjoyment from actually doing the scholarly thing with this text. I don't want you to feel like, oh, I have to do a reading reflection. No. Society is telling you what you have to do. Society is telling you, you should not be reading. How are you going to justify taking a course this summer? How are you going to justify putting all that time into a book? How are you going to justify all this time put towards a dead thinker? How are you going to justify? How are you going to? And there's this part of you that's like, because I want to, right? I don't know how to cultivate that except for just calling it what it is, right? We forget that we are rebelling against the big other and the sort of the societal expectations by reading a text like this. We forget that. And then because we've kind of adopted our own sort of niche big other, we go, no, I should be, not that I should be doing all these other things, I should be reading this text. But the moment the should, the ought, the obligation gets involved, your little rebel inside you is going to find its enjoyment counteracting that. So you just need to remember these people who laugh at you for caring about ideas, who look down on you for caring about the intellect. And remember that people think you don't have to read books to understand everything. I've got a leg up on you. I just watch the news every day. Okay, just remember those people, and hopefully that'll help you switch over. Who are you working against in your self-undermining? Are you working against yourself that wants to read, or are you working against yourself that your whole society is telling you should be? This kind of gets us to the question of the they self versus your own most self, right? All right. That's sort of a thread I hope to develop in future lectures, but for now, I want to get into it. Let's get into it. So today, lecture outline. This is, by the way, for people in the YouTube comment section, timestamping. This is where to say chapter 5 as such actually begins. So being in as such, knowing the world, okay? This is a development of what he really started doing in chapter 3, which is critique of modern philosophy. This is a really big development on that. For those who didn't make it to the end of this week's assigned section, he gets into a whole part on propositional statements, logic, and judgment. And that's important for quilting what's been going on here. All of it is building up to that section where he is critiquing traditional propositional logic and it taking over language. The subjugation of grammar to logic, which is inherently metaphysical. We have a ontology that we don't even realize comes from Descartes just because we got taught grammar as kids. We have a tendency to instantiate verbs into nouns. instead of understanding that in a lot of cases what's being described as nouns aren't anything like a subject in this sort of philosophical sense, or a substance in this sort of philosophical sense, where both of them, the essence is that it's what's essential to it is that part that is unchanging through manifold experiences, which is to say, lots of different shit happens. What stays the same, that's the real self, or that which stays the same through removing all of the secondary qualities and experiences, that's the substance, right? That's the true essence of the substance, which is like saying, so you take a table, what's a real table? We just did this in an Arendt reading, Nance and I. What's a real table? Well, you can strip it down of all of its secondary qualities and then have like this sort of completely neutered abstract conception and say, well, that's the table. Yeah, but you've removed everything from it. And so if you remove everything from it for a specific purpose, the question is do you put all of the stuff back later? It turns out most philosophers, in their stripping down of the human, never put it back together again. That's why we're going to talk about the equiprimordial constitution of the there. How do we talk about the there in being there, which is the German for Dasein, the there in being there, without breaking apart the equiprimordial constitution of the thing? How do we not break it down into little bits and pieces? This was the same thing we had to think about with being in the world. We're spending chapters upon chapters working through being in the world, which is a whole, is not to be broken up. Of course, we have to work through things one at a time, so we just kind of have to keep going back into reference to the whole, right? That's why it's basically working with this idea of foreconception, which we'll get into. We're going to talk about moods. We're going to talk about fear as an example of a mood, and then we're going to get into the force structure section. It's probably one of the coolest sections, honestly. We'll talk about some examples of force structure, because the force structure is what breaks down into the forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. And then we'll get into how assertion, aka judgment, aka propositional logic, and sort of how it possesses grammar and all of our assumptions about meaning, snatches up significance as present in hand. And then I'll ask my big question that all of this kind of stuff I've already said about Lacan ultimately alludes to. Because all of this is in a sort of sense, like this chapter especially is a critique of the Lacanian moment with people online. It's not a critique of Lacan, it's a critique of the Lacanian circles that I've peeked in on. All right. Equiprimordial constitution of the there. So on page 170, he says, the phenomenon of the equiprimordiality of constitutive items has often been disregarded in ontology because of a methodologically unrestrained tendency to derive everything and anything from some simple primal ground. This is, Anne was saying, there's so much reference to the history of philosophy, like a lot of this is going over my head because it's not just jargon, it's not just his jargon now, it's also all of this other stuff. Well, basically what he's saying here is that everyone's always trying to be hyper-reductivist in the sense of like, well, we need a foundation for knowing what's real. And so some people base that foundation in God, some people base that foundation in science, but even then, you try to reduce it down to a simple axiom and build your whole system off of that simple axiom. And so the simple axiom of the one thing that Descartes could absolutely be certain of is that he thinks, therefore, he at least knows that he is. Because in order to doubt, he must be thinking, and if he's thinking, he must be existing. So he takes his own existence as the one thing he can be most sure about, and then he builds back to the world with others, but he can't be sure about that world with others because he still could be tricked by an evil demon, or he could still be in the matrix, as we say now. And so, of course, he brings God back in as his final support. Well, because God wouldn't lie. That's why. And then, of course, he's got his whole argument for how he believes in God. And so it's like, it's the whole structure of his argument is supposed to fall apart if the beginning of it is questionable. Heidegger already made it questionable by saying he doesn't ever really get into the sum, cogito ergo sum. That is to say, the is, the am, the status of the being who is thinking. Hume cast big doubt on it by being like, what is this I you speak of? Is it a collection of experiences? What makes the I in that collection of experiences, right? It could just be a bundle of experiences. And then there's like this sort of sense that, oh, well, I am the continuity between all of these experiences. Okay, but are you? So that's, philosophers since Descartes have raised problems on this. And any philosopher who tries to be a foundationalist and build everything up from some primal ground likes to have it nice, neat, orderly, and succinct. Nice, very logical sort of unfolding of the project. Spinoza is an amazing sort of example of someone who's able to build things out propositionally. He does this in his Ethics. And probably the most admirable and astonishing feat of rolling out a whole worldview via propositional logic would be Wittgenstein's Tractatus. Okay, Tractatus starts with like one sentence. Okay, what follows from that is this. What follows from that is this. What follows from that is this. And then he inserts something else and then argues it. And then once it's supported, he adds some more things. And it's all very sequential. It's all very linear. And this is the thing that every analytic bro from the history of philosophy in the last 100 years has gotten a real hard-on for. And it is impressive. It is impressive. And it's not worthless. And it's very useful in some cases, all right? And in fact, you would all benefit from tarrying with Descartes, Spinoza, and Wittgenstein, specifically those three works, the Meditations, the Ethics, and the Tractatus. But to say the phenomenon of the equiprimordiality of constituent items has often been disregarded in ontology because of this reduction to some primal ground. What does that mean? The phenomenon of the equiprimordiality of constitutive items. Well, constitutive items just means the items that make the thing what it is, right? So constitutive just means making it as such, right? But it's also like the same kind of word. It's like this is a variation of constitution. So we say, what is the constitution of the Republic of the United States? It's all of these different elements. Okay, but then what is the constitution of a tree? Okay, it's not just socially constructed by a bunch of guys in wigs arguing about how to do a liberal democracy, right? Or a republic. No, all of a sudden we're in a different domain. But what about when we say, what are the constitutive items of Dasein's there? Dasein means being there with a hyphen. So what is the there? Right? How do we unpack the there without getting a bunch of more isolated, discrete items that are now missing something essential because they've been taken apart? This attempt to keep things together is something Lacan will actually take very seriously with his Borremian knot and how he talks about the Mobius strip, right? Right, because with the Borremian knot, you've got the real, imaginary, and symbolic. They're all they're all ultimately a part of the same thing. You lose one, you lose the others. And in the center of that is reality, right? Human reality is made sense of in the center of those three things. So it has that sort of Venn diagram function. But of course, we can just focus on the imaginary, which is to say the perceptival. It's not just in your head, it's also like how you see things, how philosophers would talk about intuition. It's like how things appear, right? That's the imaginary. Whereas symbolic is like language, power relations, etc. The real is that which can't be integrated into the imaginary and the symbolic. So everything we experience is through the imaginary and symbolic, and then the real, we're in it, but so much of it can't be counted in to our perception, to our language, to our meaning making, right? I say this just because Lacan is trying to do something similar here, which is to say he's trying to not rip apart. He's trying to honor the equiprimordial constitutiveness of these different registers, okay? So equiprimordial just means that they're on an equal basis, right? So when he's going to put discourse and state of mind on an equiprimordial basis with understanding, this is a heresy in the history of philosophy. This is a really big deal, right? He's saying no. It's not like fundamentally we are rational animals and then secondarily we have feelings, right? Hume, going back to Hume, David Hume says, it's probably the other way around. Reason is the slave to the passions. Now, of course, someone like Socrates sets up the charioteer analogy where you've got like a charioteer with two horses, right? And the ideal setup is where reason is driving the horses, and the two horses are going to be on the one side passion, honor, esteem, respect, like that whole impulse for social esteem, for respect from others. And the other horse is your appetites, your animal appetites. I got to eat and jack off, right? I got to go chase tail and, I don't know, do heroin, whatever. So it's like you've got these two horses, and then you've got the charioteer. But of course, what happens when reason is not in control of the situation? Let's just say that you are primarily being pulled every which way by your desire for honor and esteem from others. What happens if you're primarily being pulled every which way because you just want to feed those animal appetites no matter what the cost, right? Like if I cared a little bit more about social esteem, I'd probably work out a little bit more, right? Like my pot belly is the signification of my indifference to the acknowledgement or recognition of others. It's my middle finger to your fucking six pack, right? But of course that could get me killed, right? Some kind of a lifestyle where I just keep feeding my appetites and saying, well, I don't care about social esteem, isn't reasonable. Reason should be still steering the ship. And so Heidegger comes in on this history of philosophy to say, Hume is not wrong that reason, he doesn't want to say reason is slave to the impulses, that reason is slave to the passions, that reason is slave to the appetites, but they're on an equiprimordial basis. That's why we have to, through virtue ethics and philosophical conversations with ourselves and others, actually develop a conversation between our component parts. People in the CMT course are going to get a lot out of this tomorrow. But we actually have to think, how am I living? Who's actually running this operation, right? But if we just think, no, we're rational actors, we pursue what's in our interest, we're pleasure-seeking creatures, we just avoid pain, or maybe in Aristotle's sense, we seek eudaimonia, we seek a higher happiness. We're missing the fact that all of our seeking, all of our striving, all of our interpreting, all of our research, all of our discourse is all ultimately on the basis of the moods that we have. And those moods themselves are actually on the basis of states of mind. We'll get into that. But that's all just to speak to the equiprimordial basis of the there, which I have here on the screen. The way this week's reading was chopped up, you didn't get very deep into the discourse section. You mostly worked through the understanding and state of mind section. That's why I put question marks over discourse. We're basically going to save it for next week. I'll allude to some of it and give you all a sense of where it's going, but no real spoilers there. We're going to mostly be focusing on understanding and state of mind today, with their derivative concepts of interpretation and mood and the for structure, etc., assertion, whatnot. But going back to the previous slide, I want to focus on page 170 and 171 for a second. Let's turn there. If you have the physical copy of your book, hold it up to the camera for a second so I can see it. 1, 2, 3, 4. No Ahmed. Max is absent, but it's great to have it handy. If you don't have it handy, it's okay. Max does have it. Fantastic. Good job, Max. So turn to page 170 or 171. I mean, turn to both. They're on the same spread. This is an amazing part. And going back to the lecture from last week, Alexander Dugin makes a really big deal with the quote from the middle of the second paragraph on page 170, which is italicized. Dasein is the being of this between. Now, how someone like Hubert Dreyfus or how a Dreyfusinian would read this is to say, traditionally philosophers think, well, there's a subject and then there's an object. And then we can characterize the relations of the subject to the objects, and then we can analyze those things, and we can set them up. So long as they are set up in a valid form, then we can figure out if the statements as to their state of being are correct. That is to say, sound. But first, we got to set it all up in this valid way or whatever. Okay, yeah, but it's all between subjects and objects. So that is to say, we're subjects, and there's a world of objects. And then when we use language, we also turn objects into the subjects of sentences. All right? And this is not an accident of language. We are subjects of sentences in the life world or the being in the world of Dasein, right? We get made into subjects the same way that we make objects in the world into subjects of sentences, right? Everything that a continental philosopher says about a subject in a sentence is also something that they are probably thinking about in relation to the subject of a nation state, the subject of a political party, the subject of ideology critique, the subject who gets interpolated by ideological structures. Right? Well, Heidegger, they're all post-Heideggerians, but Heidegger's got problems with this talk about subjects, and we've already gotten into that. But do you basically fix the problem by saying, okay, it's not like there's us in a mind, and then there's out there a world that's the bodies, and our bodies in that world, and our mind-body relation is basically this relation between subject and object. It's not enough to say, or he doesn't think it's enough to say that they're related, that they're dependent on one another. Without the world, no mind. Without the mind, no world. It's not enough. It's not enough to put them on a continuum. It's not enough to put them on a Mobius strip. Okay? Because remember, this gives us the idea that we're talking about individual versus world. But we're trying to call into question individual in the first place, right? We're not talking about a point in space-time that we can track through a series of experiences that doesn't change, that has two eyeballs and has a lot of opinions about what it is and what it is not. We're talking about the between. Now, is the between just between those eyeballs and what it looks at? Or is the between a larger context of things? kind of opens the space for those things to make themselves intelligible, to actually have meaning. Is Dasein the disclosure of the space within which subjects and objects appear? I think that the answer is yeah, that's what it is. And so that's why it's difficult to get into the constitutive structures of the there, because we're always already there. Right? The section from the end of this week's reading is where he gets into the hermeneutic circle the most. The hermeneutic circle, meaning the interpretive circle. There's no outside of language from which to interpret human existence. There's no outside of meaning, and there's no outside of mood. And there's no outside of an understanding that has some kind of a grasp of your possibilities. That's why up here he already said that we cannot derive. He said, but the fact that something primordial is underivable does not rule out the possibility that a multiplicity of characteristics of being may be constitutive for it. So to say that, yeah, you cannot derive this threefold structure right here on the screen, this threefold structure between understanding, discourse, and state of mind. You cannot derive this from a single principle. You have to phenomenally grasp it before working through each of these constituent parts. Because Descartes doesn't do that, because Hume doesn't do that, because Spinoza doesn't do that, they end up making one of these things primary and then the other thing secondary to that primary thing. And there's just no evidence. There is no evidence that we can actually justify doing this, right? It's the same thing that he did with section A of chapter 3. He lays out what you see, and then he goes beyond what you see to the actual relationality that you can deduce from what you experience. And then from that, he goes, okay, so Descartes' account doesn't make sense, does it? Right? Well, he's doing the same thing here, but he's doing it at this even deeper level, because this is how we know ourselves and how we know the world. The other part I want to read is from page 171 has this word is a lot, italicized, you'll notice. It also has this word there a lot. Also, not italicized, but with single quotes and then with double quotes. Not always the same. Remember, I tripped up on that last week. We'll touch on why I tripped up and why I'm not any more, and I'm not any less confused than I was last week on how these translators are using the quotation marks. I actually went and looked at the German edition, and I could not see the difference between, there was no quotation around any word for there versus, double quote on one spot versus a single quote in another spot. So it wasn't in the German edition. So the translators are up to something, or I missed something. But before getting into these parts that are so important from page 171, this shit unlocks the whole chapter, really. Page 171 does. I want to go back to that part that follows directly after. Dasein is the being of this between, on page 170 in the middle of the second paragraph. He says, yet to take our orientation from this between would still be misleading. For with such an orientation, we would also be covertly assuming the entities between which this between as such is. And we would be doing so in a way which is ontologically vague, right? So once you just say, well, a lot of the problems of traditional philosophy can be dismissed because we can just say that there's a relationality between these things and that these two things get their sense of being in reference to one another. He goes, yeah, but you've assumed too much already, right? That continuity between the two is not going to be enough. On the next page, he says that entity, which is essentially constituted by being in the world, is itself in every case, it's there. this is where he gets into the here versus the yonder, which you just need to remember whenever he does this. We nowadays say that we are oriented, right? If you are in an avalanche of snow and you actually don't know if you're upside down or not, you actually need to know so that you can climb out of the snow, right? You have to dig yourself out of the avalanche, right? If you're buried under a bunch of snow, the way you figure it out is you try to spit. You try to just make some spit with your mouth and let it fall out of your mouth. You want to make it so that it drops down, right? Use gravity as your guide and then dig in the opposite direction from where the spit went, right? But why do you have to do that? You're getting oriented. You're here, but you don't know what here is without a yonder. You have to have a sense of what's yonder. You want to know what direction the sky is, right? And then once you get out, you're going to have some sense of what north is, because you hopefully have some sense of where you are on a map. But that's to say that we're always situated beings, and that orientation is like in what we do. Not everybody uses left versus right and then tries to talk about our individualized left versus right in reference to some due north, right, that we kind of bring in after the fact. Right? That difference makes it so that your left versus your right is pure relative, but north, well, that's objective. And I think Aborigines actually, in their language, have the cardinal directions hardwired into their language in a way where they don't have left and right. There is no subjective directionality in Aborigine or in Aborigines, which is to say their language is outside of them all as subjects, and it's tied into the actual geographical there-ness. And there's not this idea of, well, I've got a left and a right, and it's the opposite of your left and the right while we're facing each other. No, there's no such thing. We're facing each other in reference to these coordinates that are specific to the habitat within which our culture has adapted itself, out of which our language and all of its involvements and therefore signification and meaning itself is established. Okay? Some languages are great like that. Other ones are a lot more adept at making us subjects, which is obviously, I like it. I'm an individual, you know. I don't mind being an individual. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. But if you've got serious problems with individualism as a form of ideology, then you should also be wondering, how is that ideology reified by shit like just left and right? It's subjective. And that just being sort of like this deeply relatable, embodied metaphor. It's part of my issue with contemporary, disability activism, is the attempt to cleanse or to purge language of embodied metaphors because they might be hurtful to somebody. So you say, oh, well, so-and-so is blind to this fact. And then someone else goes, hey, that could be hurtful to a blind person. It's like, you don't fucking think a blind person knows they're blind. This is not, they're gonna hear that and just be like, oh man, other people don't want to be in my situation? Fuck. No. Of course, if they're trying to get social justice points for it, maybe. But in reality, everybody finds these embodied metaphors super relatable. And the push to purge language of embodied metaphors is simultaneously bad for people who are already having difficult time getting on the same wavelength as other people, which therefore makes it actually counterproductive for people who have other kinds of disabilities trying to understand and get on the same wavelength as others. I would put autism as like the most obvious candidate for a lot of people. Probably have an issue with language becoming further and further removed from anything tangible. What Heidegger is trying to do on this page is really drive home the point that we've been saying Dasein this whole time, but we're not talking about a spiritual essence. We're not talking about this sort of universal thing. Of course, Dasein is universal because anybody who participates in Dasein, they participate in this universal. But this universal has a particularity cooked into its definition. The particularity is the there. Middle paragraph of 171. When we talk in an ontically figurative way of the lumen naturale in man, we have in mind nothing other than the existential ontological structure of this entity, that it is in such a way as to be its there. To say that it is illuminated means that as being in the world, it is cleared in itself, not through any other entity, but in such a way that it is itself the clearing. The Aborigines have a clearing with their language, with their culture, with their there that they are in. They've cleared the space within which to disclose being, to understand and live with and deal in a world of meanings, to be able to recognize one another. To be able to recognize one another, to be able to understand the difference between a kangaroo and a tree, they have language. And they share in meaning making. But they're not making these meanings arbitrarily out of nothing. They share a bunch of base involvements upon which there are, for the sakes of which is that structure the kinds of tools and language they use to orient themselves and make sense of their there. Fucking English. The first there is T-H-E-I-R. There, T-H-E-R-E. There, T-H-E-R-E. And if I was writing that out, I would have put the middle one in quotes. So, are, there would be where we are. Planet Earth, roughly speaking. But obviously, they're more dialed in than planet Earth, right? We could dial ourselves into Zoom itself. We could dial from Zoom down into this specific call, right? That's our there, in a certain sense. And if you're not super distracted right now, then the there in, or the there of, I guess we should say our here, the here of the Zoom call will be closer to you than the here that is immediate in the room that you're in. But then also the goal is to bring you closer to the text itself. So in a sort of sense, the there of our Dasein here now is page 171. Nance is cracking up. It's not going to get any easier for a second here. And I'm going to go back to the clearing in a moment. This is like one of the most famous things from Heidegger, is the clearing. He doesn't get into it so much here. He gets into it a lot more throughout the rest of his life. But he says, only for an entity which is existentially cleared in this way does that which is present at hand become accessible in the light or hidden in the dark. By its very nature, Dasein brings its there along with it. If it lacks its there, it is not factically the entity which is essentially Dasein. Indeed, it is not this entity at all. For Dasein is its disclosedness. Now, that disclosedness is not something an individual does, going back to the lecture from last week. This is why, so traditionally people read Heidegger as just some synthesis between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche on the shoulders of Dilthey and Husserl, borrowing somewhat from probably his frustrations with Marxism and Hegelianism. All right, no. This is not a synthesis. This is an imminent critique of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. And the point is no. Nietzsche might have spent a lot of time off in solitude, marching around up on those hills, hiking. but he was fundamentally being with in the world. And a lot of times he was actually in solicitude, not solitude, when he was out there, because he's arguing with real people, dead and alive. And he's having a real conversation, not just with himself, but with people in the past, people in the present, and he's writing to people in the future, which is something anybody who's read my book, Waypoint, knows that I'm ultimately doing is I'm preparing myself to talk to people in the future. Waypoint is for people who are like fellow travelers right now, who are also preparing themselves to be able to say something meaningful, right? Everybody wants to have a voice these days, but nobody thinks about what they're actually going to say with that voice, and if it's actually going to be different from what everyone else is saying, and if it's actually going to get through, if it'll actually convey anything meaningful, right? So the idea of a period of time preparing ourselves to be able to say something meaningful once you actually get to have a voice. This is something that we're doing. It's something that any serious thinker is doing, and it's what I'm saying Nietzsche was doing. But the point is he wasn't this radical individualist, acting on his own will to power. He was he was his there. And the world disclosure is something he partook in, but it's something that presupposed his existence. And he couldn't have had this conversation without already appearing in a clearing that is there. And that clearing is an extremely German clearing. He wouldn't have made sense outside of that German clearing. And of course, that German clearing wouldn't have been what it was if it wasn't in dialogue with and potential war with neighboring countries. But you think that he's arguing with Christians, Jews, and British empiricists and utilitarians just because he wants to philosophically? No, there's also something fundamental about the clearing he's in that shows him that there's something fundamentally missing in British empiricism, in utilitarianism, in Judaism, or Christianity. Dasein brings its there along with it. Yeah, you go up into the hills and you're walking around on your hike, but you bring your there with you. And if you fail to bring your there with you, you ain't Dasein. Right? You ain't. Now this is actually, Mikey gave me something great on this, relating it back to Lacan here for a second. Psychosis is the inability to be a participant in disclosure. Psychosis is the inability to understand the there, to be able to integrate into the there. So psychosis, using it as a Lacanian concept, not as the DSM-5 definition. So this would also count as the basis for schizophrenia, all right? This is a more expansive idea of psychosis that probably counts for borderline, okay? This idea of psychosis, it's like, for whatever the reasons are, you were not able to assimilate to language in a way where you can have shared meaning with other people. You might have learned how to use language like the little girl in the Chinese room thought experiment, but you aren't able to share in signification the way everyone else is. So the psychotic is not just profoundly alone. The psychotic is arguably not Dasein. But then there's also the argument that extreme individualism is psychotic. Right? Mikey made a post about that this week. And for anybody who's weirded out, like who's Mikey, anybody who's more in touch with the stuff that I do, he's one of my will know that he's one of my main fellow travelers. Just like Anne, just like Nance, just like Elton, just like Brian, just like Cadell. So Dasein is its disclosedness really actually establishes my argument from last week. And it's about to get a lot more traction in a section that Nance actually sent me a quote from this week. He was like, "Oh my God, this quote is really good. This quote just supports your argument from last week, Dave." Dasein is its disclosedness means at the same time that the being which is an issue for this entity in its very being is to be its there. In addition to characterizing the primary constitution of the being of disclosedness, we will require, in conformity with the course of the analysis, an interpretation of the kind of being in which this entity is its there in an everyday manner. We're not going to read the next page where he goes into extreme detail to show how Part A and Part B fit together in this chapter. Just to say that next week is where we get into the everyday manner. This week is just so that we actually have some context for that everyday manner. So the stuff from the last week, chapter 4, where we started talking about the they, that's what he brings back in the second part of this chapter. It's a banger. It's the juicy bits. It's all the stuff that people quote. They love to, right? And the problem is that they read it through this sort of Nietzschean, Sartrean, Kierkegaardian, Camusian, existentialist, individualist lens. We will be on guard keeping that interpretation alongside the other one that was fleshed out last week. This raises important questions such as, what happens if a person is removed from their there? What if a person loses their language? What if a person loses their home? What if that person is a refugee in another country? What if that person is an immigrant from a different culture, from a different society, and now they're somewhere else? I feel like actually what this does is this shouldn't just give us over to saying, oh, well, that person's lost their world, now they're not Dasein. No, because they still have that language. They still have those contacts, some of them probably. Even if they aren't able to communicate with their family, even if their family's dead, they're still close to that family. They're still close to that language. And so the question of assimilation comes up. Obviously, there is the standpoint that if you come to the United States, you are supposed to assimilate to the American lifestyle. But of course, half of the political spectrum says assimilating to the American lifestyle means doing your culture here. Because the liberal understanding of assimilation is, yeah, be Portuguese American, be African American, be Irish American. Don't say, oh, I'm American and we all live the same way. No. Figure out how to make a world out of where you are and where you're from. So the American conception is modular. It's open to that kind of adaptation. And assimilation doesn't have to be assimilation to a single model of way of life. And part of like the individualist liberal project is figuring out how you're going to do that. And if you're going to really do it, if you're going to actually pull it off, you're not doing it by yourself. You are doing it by making friends from other people, with other people who also feel like outsiders to whatever this made-up mainstream actually is. This made-up they, the American Das Mann, right? We're all trying to figure that out. Punks are trying to figure that out. Hip-hop scenes are trying to figure that out. Blues, jazz, trying to figure that out. I'm just using music scenes, but every niche boutique consumer identity you can be sold online or that you can subscribe to is ultimately some kind of attempted answer to this problem of giving you a there, giving you an interpretation of your there. But of course, for someone who says, no, the there is in blood and soil, which is to say, the there is geographically bound, and it was geographically won in its boundedness by war, which is to say, your ancestors spilled their blood on that soil. Your culture grew out of fertilized soil that was fertilized with the blood of your ancestors. They won it by conquest, right? And that's why the people who marched in Charlottesville, who are so anti-immigrant, march saying, blood and soil, go back home, Jews, or whatever they say. But like the blood and soil thing comes from Nazis. They say, Blut und Boden. Well, that wasn't something that Himmler made up after Hitler came to power. Hitler wouldn't have come to power if it wasn't for the decade Heidegger was living in when this book was being fleshed out. And the word Boden appears over 72 times in this book because it also appears in a lot of other forms, including Bodenständigkeit and Bodenlosständigkeit or something like that. The word loss is in Bodenständigkeit in the second derivation, which is to say rootedness in soil versus uprootedness from soil. Right? And Boden appears in multiple words, in multiple ways, because the people who translated this text, which is the most famous and authoritative translation in American English, or I guess just in English, but it's not American English at all, actually. It's fucking Shakespearean English. But the people who translated it do not keep that soil metaphor alive throughout this. It only comes up every once in a while. But every time you find a word like free floating, that word is referencing uprootedness. But there's other ways that uprooted appears in this text that get translated in other ways. And so that's why I'm like really going through the German and I just can't wait to be able to actually read this thing in German eventually. But for right now, you know, I just have to kind of do it this way. But the word Boden is all throughout this, and it is soil. And I think that Heidegger has a profound issue with blood because he doesn't like the biological metaphor used for race. So he doesn't really like blood and soil, but he does like soil, and he likes there being an idea of a spiritual claim to some soil. That spiritual claim to that soil is not through blood so much as something else. So the last thing we have to say about this page, and I know we've spent a long time on this page, there's a few pages we're going to spend a lot of time on today, but the reason we've spent so much time here is because this idea of the there is the key to this whole chapter, but I think it's the key to Dasein, and Dasein's the key to the whole book. And if you don't get the fact that the there that Dasein is, if you don't get that the there isn't relative in the way that it is for a liberal interpreting this text, then you're not really struggling with this. If you want Heidegger to be a frenemy, which is to say, like, you know, he's a fellow traveler that's a sort of enemy, but you give him serious credence as a thinker and you take it very seriously and you really work through the ideas. You cannot just whittle him down to this relativistic, oh, everybody's got their there. Some people their there is being a baseball player. Some people their there is living in Athol, Idaho. Like, sorry, no, it's not so easy. Now, of course, we can, after we've really tarried with Heidegger, have a more robust conversation of, so he's onto something, he's correct about something, but what are ways of saying that there might be other ways of clarifying the there? Right? If he just thinks that it's a nation state bounded by a language and some kind of a territory and a history, couldn't we argue that it's some kind of a future ideal? Because for Alain Badiou, it is the communist idea, right? Badiou is a Heideggerian, Lacanian, who, instead of it being blood and soil and a nation state, it's actually this communist ideal. And I suggested last week, couldn't it be underground theory itself? Couldn't you say that I am willing the Dasein of underground theory? I don't want underground theory to be a mere scene as a consumer demographic for a niche boutique, you know, tendency online, but actually something that goes beyond lifestyle and actually lays the groundwork for future movements, something that lays the groundwork for something that currently is impossible, right? Well, then we'd have to have a more robust conversation about what is an intellectual milieu. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions of the kind of thing out of which a conception of an ourself can even emerge that is capable of circumnavigating or overcoming all the other deadlocks currently posed by everyone's already prefigured identities and modes of life. The clearing metaphor, though, is what he gets from walking through the dark forest. Anne and I have been lost in the dark forest outside of Freiburg, Germany. Right? Anne and I have both tripped over things in that black forest, but we haven't spent weeks, much less years of our lives, wandering the paths of the black forest. Heidegger did just that, right? Heidegger wandered the paths of the black forest all the time. It's where his best thinking took place. And there's a whole history of philosophy that could just be looked at through the lens of where were they walking around when they were thinking? Because in most cases, they studied intensively while sitting, but spent a lot of time walking. Kant was not seen by the locals as a guy who wrote this big book. He was first seen for decades as this guy who walks through the city like clockwork at specific times. Later on, they realized, oh my God, this guy's a goddamn genius, right? And so they kind of quilted him later as like this thinker. But no, people who grew up in Königsberg, they saw him as a walker. Yeah, Rousseau was constantly walking through France. Nietzsche was constantly hiking. Heidegger was constantly hiking as well. But he was hiking through the Black Forest. I'm going to put up on the screen here an example of what I'm talking about. It is now slush rain. We're coming down through the woods.
Scavenging, scouring through the woods.
We climbed up.
We should be careful of like
a bog.
a bog, yeah.
We climbed up a castle to get into a window to see Lenin's big fat head. Okay, I can't actually get too much into the details of that, but we actually did climb up into a window at a museum so that we could see the closed off section where there was a bunch of contraband. And I don't, that's a distraction from what I'm trying to show you all right now. But what you're looking at is a clearing in the Black Forest. Now it's not beautiful, it's sleeting at the moment, which is to say rain plus snow. We call that sleeting in American Standard English. But this is a clearing, right? This is a naturally occurring clearing. But to really get the metaphor he's using here, when he says to say that it is illuminated means that as being in the world, it is cleared in itself, not through any other entity, but in such a way that it is itself the clearing. Only for an entity which is existentially cleared in this way does that which is present at hand become accessible in the light or hidden in the dark. Is to say that if you are in the forest and the trees are really, really tall and there's no clearings, everything's dimly lit. You can barely see anything. At various points, Heidegger kind of waffles on this idea of whether it's never like, so sometimes he talks about Dasein like it's either something you have or it's something you don't have. Other times he talks about it like, well, the entity is itself Dasein. But then other times he talks about it like, no, there's like animals can be world poor. Like, which is to say, like, we're Dasein is world rich. Animals, it's not like they don't have a world. It's just like their world is poor because it lacks like the sophisticatedness of language, and you could probably argue our temporal lobes and all of this other stuff. So, they're less in time in the sense that we are, blah, blah, blah. But, no, this is... The reason I bring this in right now, like the idea of world poor, is because if the forest is super dark, but you can still make your way around it, that's kind of what he's getting at when he talks about being poor in world. Now, a clearing has opened up the pit, so to speak. It has removed the trees from a big enough area that sunlight actually pours in and illuminates things, right? To say that Dasein is the clearing, that Dasein is the disclosedness, is that to say it's not, no, Dasein is not the little being running around the trails coming out into clearings. No, Dasein is the clearing. Aborigines have cleared a space, not in sort of mathematical space, as we already talked about, but they have cleared a meaningful space in Australia. I think they're in Australia. I'm not right. I'm using the right people, right? Yeah. Okay. Good. Just making sure I wasn't messing it up. But yeah, Aborigines have cleared this space in Australia, and Germans have cleared this space in Germany. How did they clear it? They secured it. They had to win it. They had to make it. They had to come out from prehistory into a space where they're able to gather enough surplus labor, surplus resources, so as to be able to set up historians who are able to tell us about where we've been and what's gone on since we've won this clearing. Right? History is the thing that happens once the clearing is secured, and history is supposed to kind of keep opening and fleshing out that clearing, illuminating being in a way that is disclosed through cultural particularity. I'm not saying that this is like my theory of how things work. I'm saying this is what Heidegger is saying, right? Ever since last week's lecture, Michael Downs has been working through it. And for those who know he's a fellow traveler but don't know much else, or know that he taught me Lacan and not much else, you just got to know he spent 4 years reading nothing but Heidegger, and he was doing it with two of his buddies, and they went hard. And he was a big-time Heideggerian. I've seen his bookshelf. He's got everything that you can get in English on Heidegger. It's all there. You got all of the primary works from Heidegger's whole life. It's just like sometimes multiple translations and editions and stuff like that. So when I sent him the lecture from last week, he's been tripping up on it, and he argued with me, and he really posed a problem for me because I'm trying to focus on the next chapter. I wasn't trying to go back over my lecture. I wasn't trying to work through this interpretation. So I kind of was like, dude, I am not convinced by my own lecture yet. I am still working through this. I just had to overstate my case because I'm working against Blattner and Dreyfus and everything they've done to the American scene. Right? I'm just intervening, and I'm doing it assertively enough that I feel responsible to keep fleshing this out and then actually make a decision on, well, what is my interpretation of Heidegger? Because right now, I don't just have Dugin's interpretation. In fact, most of what I gave you last week wasn't Dugin. Most of what I gave you last week was me reading Heidegger through Richard Wolin and just kind of understanding the historical context. The Dugin stuff I brought in was just to make it contemporaneous, to make it relevant, timely, to show you that there is someone who's reading it this way, right? But that's not to say I owe that reading to Dugin. I mean, you can read Dugin's book on Heidegger from 2014, and it doesn't really argue the case that I was making in my lecture last week. He gets into an application of it, a specific application of it in his fourth political theory, but I still have to develop my interpretation, and so I really just wanted to keep you all from this individualistic, existentialist habit that people bring with them to this text. And Mikey sent me 25 long quotes from this text. Each of those long quotes, he sent me a voice message where he basically reads it and problematizes my interpretation using the quote and saying, well, if you're right, then how does this quote stand up? How would this quote make sense? And so what I did was I spent the better part of a couple of days actually going through one at a time, saying, well, here's how that makes sense, and here's how that makes sense. And then I had to go and actually pull out the German translation, or the original edition, and I had to sit there and I had to go through a bunch of sections that were causing us issues in this interpretation. Mikey's arguing with himself at this point. He's not just arguing with me. He said, I think he said yesterday, that he's basically convinced of my reading, and that's largely because of the historical context that I laid out last week. Okay, that changes everything, right? But anyway, coming back around, when I assert the primordial existential priority of your socio-political, cultural, linguistic, and geographically derived there-ness, I think I'm trying to give Heidegger his due here, and I'm not simping for this. But I want to tarry with it and wrestle with it and take it seriously and not just turn it into what I want him to be saying. Okay? The rest of those videos maybe we'll get at through the rest of this lecture course. I do want to show you all Heidegger's hut and stuff like that. Did I already do that in this course? No? Christopher says no. Where did I show it, Nance?
We got into that on the Volin, the 24-hour.
Right. So our 24-hour exegetical reading of Wohlen's Heidegger in Ruins, where we did like our whole like impromptu lectures along the way and juxtaposed Wohlen to Gregory Stein, which you all have access to through the forum. But yeah, I ended up showing it in there. I'll show it in here eventually, but we're about to move into what I think is a lot more exciting. Anyway, I just want to read this last paragraph. Actually, Nance, you got to read it since you were laughing at this. Here it is on the screen. It's highlighted.
The there that is there in the there for the being there.
That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the there that is there in the there for the being there. You know, Heidegger never even says it in that frustrating of a way. Heidegger actually is being nice to us all. He could have said it that way, but that is what he's talking about. I put the first there in these quotes because it's what we're talking about. That's the subject of this chapter. The there that is emphasized so strongly because nothing and everything that we mean by the term is and there and being is because of the there that is in the there, which is to say in being in the world, for the being who is essentially there, right? Anne's about to fucking rage quit, I can tell. Don't worry, I won't keep doing this. I just wanted to kind of emphasize that up until this point in the lecture, but for the rest of the lecture, I will not talk this way. This is the simple version of what we have. And this, to me, once I actually figured it out, is kind of the thing that I always go back to. So whenever other people are talking about Heidegger, they never talk about this. No one that just talks about Heidegger outside of a course on this chapter talks about the equiprimordiality of understanding discourse and state of mind. But if you remember nothing else from this entire course, I hope you remember this slide right here, which I drew out with my own goddamn handwriting. Dasein is the being there, but the there is understanding discourse state of mind. When we talk about disclosure and the clearing, that is made by understanding discourse and state of mind. Let's go to page 182 to talk about understanding, and then we'll go to page 178 to talk about state of mind. And we'll start with having Nance, read from page 182, and Anne, read from page 178. We'll get to that one in a second. Let's go to 182. And yeah, Nance, just read the second paragraph of section 31.
We have, after all, already come up against this primordial understanding in our previous investigations, though we did not allow it to be included explicitly in the theme under discussion. To say that in existing, Dasein is its there is equivalent to saying that the world is there. Its being there is being in. And the latter is likewise there, as that for the sake of which Dasein is. In the for the sake of which, existing being in the world is disclosed as such, and this disclosedness we have called understanding. In the understanding of the for sake of which, the significance which is grounded therein is disclosed along with it. The disclosedness of understanding, as the disclosedness of the for sake of which, and of significance equiprimordially, pertains to the entirety of being in the world. Significance is that on the basis of which the world is disclosed as such. To say that the for sake of which and significance are both disclosed in Dasein means that Dasein is that entity which, as being in the world, is an issue for itself.
Thank you. I volunteered Nance to read somebody's audiobook yesterday, partially just as a compliment because I think he's a great voice reader, or he's got a great voice for reading or for narration. A lot of you do, by the way, but also he's put a lot of thought into his sound equipment, which is why he comes through sounding so much better, I think, than the rest of us. Of course, he's got such a perfectionist ear for it. He hears nothing but problems now, which is funny. But we don't hear those problems. We just hear crystal clear, man. But okay, let's look at this. To say that an existing Dasein is it's there is equivalent to saying that the world is there. It's being there is being in. How are you going to separate Dasein into being an individual when he just said that? How are you going to make Dasein into an individual when he just said that? And the latter is likewise there, as that for the sake of which Dasein is. He's saying what our for the sake of which even is. Remember when Blattner last week was having a problem with the idea that there's an ultimate for the sake of which was survival? And he was like, well, I like to sit on a committee and I want to be a dad and all these other things. And it's like, okay, yeah, I get it, man. I agree. And we all have to do that kind of time, energy, budgeting, juggling, prioritizing and whatnot. But your there is for the sake of which Dasein is, right? And it's the world. And unless you're trying to relativize world to being the individual's world, I just can't make sense of that. Why would we do that though? You think that the clearing is made by an individual in the woods? What do you say, Nance?
Ideology.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the one thing, right? Absolutely. Now, Christopher's back. Christopher, can you read from the middle section of page 183, starting with basically kind of in the middle where it says the being possible, and then down to the end of that paragraph?
Sure. The being possible, which is essential for Dasein, pertains to the ways of its solicitude for others and of its concern with the world, as we have characterized them. And in all these and always, it pertains to Dasein's potentiality for being towards itself, for the sake of itself. The being possible, which Dasein is existentially, in every case, is to be sharply distinguished both from empty logical possibility and from the contingency of something present at hand. As far as which, sorry, hold on a second, sorry. I lost where I was. Sorry.
As a modal category of presence at hand, possibility signifies. Is that where we are?
I'm going to take it from the top. Sorry about that. The being possible, which is essential for my ADD was acting up. The being possible for which is essential for Dasein pertains to the ways of its solicitude for others and of its concern with the world as we have characterized them. And in all these and always, it pertains to Dasein's potentiality for being towards itself for the sake of itself. The being possible, which Dasein is existentially in every case, is to be sharply distinguished both from empty logical possibility and from the contingency of something present at hand. So far as with the present at hand, this or that can come to pass. As a modal category of presence at hand, possibility signifies what is not yet actual and what is not at any time necessary. It characterizes the merely possible. Ontologically, it is on a lower level than actuality and necessity. On the other hand, possibility as an exponential is the most primordial and ultimate positive way in which Dasein is characterized ontologically. As with existentiality in general, we can in the first instance only prepare for the problem of possibility. The phenomenal basis for seeing it at all is provided by the understanding as a disclosive potentiality for being.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Possibility, 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 possibility. What else is here, right? He's just talking about possibility a lot. This is the section where he's talking about being there as understanding. Okay. What is it we understand? We understand possibilities. We are like the mentats and the navigators from Doom. We are beings for whom there is a horizon of possibilities, and we are always sorting through those possibilities. We do not just walk into a room and assess it in some sort of objective way. We assess the room for what we're up to, for what we need it for. If you walk into a room and you're doing a drug deal and you think that the drug deal might go bad, and you did not come prepared, and you're actually like not sure if you're about to have to defend yourself, then the way that you assess the room is going to be very different than if you are in the room waiting for your date to show up because you're going to Netflix and chill. Okay? Those two moods fundamentally color the room. But it's to put it more precisely, it shifts the circumspective, ready to hand relationship to the space you're in. Meaning that the shovel that is within arm's reach is something you're going to notice in the first instance. You probably don't even notice it unless you just kind of want to hide it in the closet before your date gets there in the second instance, right? So in the first case, you go, okay, I might have to grab the shovel and bash someone on the head, and that person might have a gun, and I'll have to whap that person right there on their wrist. Like, you're actually sitting there thinking about, like, what are you going to do? I'm going to John Wick these people, right? Well, on the date coming over, no, you're not thinking about the shovel. You're making sure that, okay, so the space looks tidy enough. I look good. The television's working. Netflix, whatever. Like, okay, we've got some drinks that we can pull out, whatever. You're thinking about it through. Right? The entire room is different. It's disclosed differently by the mood. But it's the possibilities that you're seeing. You're not seeing some shovel that's within reach. In either of these stories, the shovel that is there, in the first case, it's there meaningfully lit up as a potential weapon. In the second case, it's meaningfully lit up as something that might seem out of place okay, I should probably put this in the closet. This doesn't actually go here. She's going to think I'm messy, right? What you're seeing is a possibility in both cases. On the one case, it's the possibility of whapping people with this thing. You're seeing the possibility of these people getting you, of pulling a gun on you, of trying to rob you, whatever. In the other case, you're seeing the possibility of her being like, oh, that's weird. And of course, I'm defaulting to the guy's perspective in this. I'm sorry. But you're going to, okay, I have to clean this up. It's the possibility of her thinking you're a slob that's driving your action in that moment. If you're looking at this from a purely empiricist standpoint, trying to be nothing but behavioralist, trying to just go off of what you're seeing from the outside, and you're just looking at this person kind of tidying up and stuff like that, you could just describe this person is tidying up. But from the standpoint of the person tidying up, the driver of what is being empirically discerned is modal. Modal, meaning having to do with possibility, actuality, necessity, contingency. I have a picture here for understanding as modal. It's underneath the equiprimordial understanding, discourse, and state of mind. And I've just got a bunch of people. We got an old man on a walker. We've got some guy with his head crossed out who's using a hammer, and it says "for the sake of which" in the thought bubble above, because really he's not there. He's in the involvement in that moment, right? He's in flow, right? And it's towards that "for the sake of which" that he's hammering. And you got these kids, and this one kid's looking at it. Two kids are looking at the toy, but the one kid looking at the toy is torn between the toy and the cookies. You got like a parent, maybe a mom, holding a baby. Maybe it's a dad. Who knows? We don't know. I didn't put genitalia on this thing. And we got some rich guy, Monopoly man. His money go up. But the whole situation, I did like these green lines everywhere, and I did these little squares, and I did these little diamonds, and I did these little tilde symbols beside some of the diamonds and some of the squares. What's the tilde do? Does anybody know what the tilde does?
Does that make it like not?
Yeah.
That.
Yeah. So the diamond means possibility, the square means necessity. This is modal logic. So in modal logic, the square means necessary or necessity. The diamond means possibility. Tilde possibility means not possible, and tilde square means not necessary. Right? Makes sense. This is the field of circumspection for you, right? And depending on what you want and what you're up to, what your goals are, what you're trying to do, what you're actually doing, like all of these things, it's going to determine like actually the way that this space makes sense. The entire ready-to-hand circumspective field of involvements and all of the things that are in order to this or that or the other thing, it's going to be lit up different by what's going on. And I put the word threat on the outside of both sides. Now, because the parent is the one lit up and close to the word threat, I think that we can assume that that parent is on high alert because they care for their precious little one and they're aware that their child could be harmed. And threat is also close to the old man who's on the walker. And he's happy, but he's also got a possibility hanging over his head that has a tilde on it, which is not possible, which is to say, he could be not possible soon. Because all of us obviously could die. But as you get older, the chances are you might have to think about that possibility of no more possibilities a little bit more, right? Thankfully, he's pretty happy about it. He's been thinking about it for a long time. Maybe he drank a bunch of copeology, right? He's been on the copium. He's been telling himself that he's going to go to Wonderland forever and have everything he ever wanted for all eternity. And maybe that's why he's happy. He's like, I'm out of here, bitches. See ya. Who knows? I'm just reading into his smiley face. I didn't really put much thought into it when I made the smiley face originally, and now I'm kind of retroactively quilting this dude. But we'll come back to this slide and talk a little bit more about the modal field put in existential terms as opposed to the way that analytic philosophers talk about modality, which is fucking annoying and so stupid. And it's not stupid, but they just never really, in all the classes that I took, bothered to show me how it's truly relevant. And so they end up doing a lot of this like, okay, we've got a proposition. It's not necessarily true, though. For it to be necessarily true, then it would have to be true in all possible worlds. And then they do this thought experiment where it would have to be true in all possible worlds. If it's not true in all possible worlds, then it's not logically necessarily true. Guess what? Heidegger doesn't give a flying fuck about logical necessity as much as he does existential necessity. Right? But if we go back to the quote that Christopher just read, in the very middle, he says, as a modal category of presence at hand, possibility signifies what is not yet actual and what is not at any time necessary. Yeah, but he's critiquing that. He says, ontologically, it is on a lower level than actuality and necessity. Yeah, but he's critiquing that. He's critiquing traditional ontology here, which is why he then says, on the other hand, possibility is an existential. As an existential is the most primordial and ultimate positive way in which Dasein is characterized ontologically. Which is to say, you could look at me how I am right now. This is not just actually me. This is the possibility of me that I am here disclosed as. You are not just you are a possible you. If you think about the multiverse, this is the universe in which you did X, Y, and Z things to now be here as such. Right? But Heidegger doesn't give a fuck about the multiverse. He only cares about the world that we are in. We are there. There. Now, if you watch the most recent Doctor Strange, then you'll know that too much thinking about the multiverse leads to a sort of sense of nihilism, right? There's dark Doctor Strange who spent way too long down that rabbit hole. And you could watch all of Rick and Morty as a thought experiment of what happens when you've got a portal gun that goes through the multiverse. What does that do to a guy? Well, one thing, he's got to drink every fucking moment of the day just to keep going. Because ultimately, he's having to fight other versions of himself. Right? I mean, that the lore for Rick and Morty goes really deep right there. Or if you've seen Everything Everywhere All at Once. Once again, it's the entire movie is about if the multiverse is true, then isn't everything just relative to the subject and therefore meaningless? And therefore nihilism is the true state of things? And we all might as well be fighting with hot dog swords or whatever. I don't know. Like, it's a really weird movie. Definitely worth watching. One of the best low-budget films ever made. Hands down. Anne's nodding. I'm nodding. Nance is nodding. Three of you not nodding right now. Got to go watch Everything Everywhere All at Once. Doctor Strange, the most recent one. Yeah, it's, what is it called? Madness? I don't know.
Multiverse of Madness?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The madness that ensues is the madness from nihilism. So what we have between that one and Everything Everywhere All at Once is the difference between low budget and high budget. But they're both dealing with the sort of sense of nihilism. What if I am just a version of an infinite amount of other versions who've made other decisions. For the woman in Everything Everywhere All at Once, she's actually the most average of all of the versions of herself, which is why she actually is able to be the protagonist that they need to solve the problem that's going on. She is the averaged version who said no to every crazy possibility, right? She could have fallen in love with a philosopher, and she could have fallen in love with her own career as a dancer, right? Oh, and this other one, she just gets so into martial arts that she becomes this like aficionado, right? Well, we might not live in a multiverse, and we might actually live in a multiverse, but we don't know for sure, and it doesn't really matter for Heidegger because we know that we are here, and it is the fact that we're here that we have to deal with primarily. What to do with that facticity, because it's not factuality, remember? It's the facticity. We're talking about the kind of factuality that's specific to the kind of being for whom disclosiveness is possible, right? Which is to say, there are no entities present at hand that can be analyzed outside of the context of signification that gives them their meaning in that disclosedness, right? Which is to say, your choice to be you, to be the possible that you are, because you're a possible. You could have been some other possibility, but no, you are this possibility. And to be that meaningfully means nothing if you haven't said no to certain opportunities. Means absolutely nothing if you've just gone along with the flow your whole life. Authentically choosing existence absolutely comes down to understanding what is your unique possibilities as opposed to those possibilities that everybody else is choosing. Now, I just said that in a way that could be interpreted the Dreyfus-Blattner way, or that could be interpreted the way I used last week. Because your there-ness, my there-ness is North Idaho. Parents from Canada, moved from Canada to California, had me as the first child in a long line of children because they wanted to have children to be good little Christians. And they wanted to homeschool those children because they wanted to get away from California and raise good God-fearing children out in the woods of North Idaho, okay? That is a situatedness, a there-ness. It's very specific. It's very dialed in to a lot of specificities. It's dialed into where I grew up. I couldn't walk to a McDonald's. To sneak out to the movie theater that I wasn't allowed to go to required riding my bicycle for 3 hours to get there. And I did a few times, right? But that takes some kind of something to go bicycling for 3 hours to get somewhere. My kind of dedication, commitment, earnestness, passion, energy that comes through is not from a vacuum. And it might not have existed if I had just gone to a regular public school. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the recipe because obviously I've got a lot of siblings. They have their own personalities and ways that they developed out of that situation. But it's not just my situatedness. The there isn't necessarily mine. It's one that I was thrown into. It belongs to a context of involvements. It belongs to signification that wasn't up to me. I don't choose it. I have to cope with it. I have to figure out what to do with it. And insofar as I'm delusional whenever I say I, insofar as I'm delusionally cut off every time I say I am this, you are that, we are different. It just makes me think, I got to step back and think, yeah, but what about the there, that is there, that's not mine, that is ours? Who do I share a there with? Which of these theirs is artificial? Which of these theirs is genuinely involved in something meaningful, purposive, right? Like these are the problems, these are the questions, but it's all based in possibility because how I think about my past is ultimately being directed by how I think about my possibilities, my future. And when I say mine, I might mean ours. I might mean ours, right? I'm struggling between these two interpretations here. But we all become like the locus of Dasein when we have to choose things. I think we do. And I'm bringing in this temporal element right now that he's not bringing in. He doesn't do it until Division 2. Division 2 is basically recapitulating everything he's done already, but now through temporality, right? And what I just did was kind of give away a little bit of how that's going to go. We are circumspectively aware of our past, but our past becomes an issue for concern and gets lit up in how we appropriate from our forehaving of the past with an eye to our foreconception of where we're going, of what kind of future we want to move into. This is part of how temporality gets involved with an existential modal logic as opposed to this, well, in order for this proposition to be necessarily true, it has to be true in all possible worlds. There's reasons why they do that, but goddamn, they do not do existential modality or existential modal logic. They don't do that. And that is exactly what Heidegger is doing. I took a whole class on modal logic. What we primarily focused on was this book. Fuck, do I have the book ready to hand? I don't want to have to go looking for it too much. Let's see, I do. I have it. I'm going to pull it up on the screen here so you can all see it. It's called On the Plurality of Worlds by David Lewis. Anybody here familiar with this book? He says, the world we live in is a very inclusive thing. Here, let's make it so you can all see that. Here, let's bring it over like this. The world we live in is a very inclusive thing. Every stick and every stone you have ever seen is part of it. And so are you and I. And so are the planet Earth, the solar system, the entire Milky Way, the remote galaxies we see through telescopes, and, if there are such things, all the bits of empty space between the stars and galaxies. There is nothing so far away from us as not to be a part of our world. Anything at any distance at all is to be included. Likewise, the world is inclusive in time. No long-gone ancient Romans, no long-gone pterodactyls, no long-gone primordial clouds of plasma are too far in the past. Nor are the dead dark stars too far in the future to be part of this same world. Maybe, as I myself think, the world is a big physical object, or maybe some part of it are intellects or spirits or auras or deities or other things unknown to physics. But nothing is so alien in kind as not to be a part of our world, provided only that it does exist at some distance and direction from here, or at some time before or after or simultaneous with now. So he's going to be defending not only a plurality of possible worlds, but also a plurality of impossible worlds, whereof you speak truly by contradicting yourself. And all of this is like where analytic philosophy through David Lewis is getting into thinking about metaphysics again. But analytic philosophy spent 100 years not thinking about metaphysics and was primarily focused on logic and epistemology. Well, the entire time, analytic philosophy has, well, especially within the last 50 years, analytic philosophy has had this tendency to qualify essences using recourse to these, the proposition is true if and only if it is necessary in all possible worlds. And when they say all possible worlds, the tendency is not to do what David Lewis is going to do, which is to take this plurality of worlds seriously. They're just doing it as a thought experiment, as a way of helping qualify and weigh truth claims, right? If something's not necessary in all possible worlds, that is to say that it's contingent. And then we have to figure out why it's contingent, all right? But contingent just means not necessary. That's all it means. It's not that big of a deal. For everything else that we're doing the rest of this time, I will mostly not be referring back to analytic philosophy or propositional logic, but that is what Heidegger is arguing against implicitly with what he does in the section on assertion, and it's what he's doing explicitly when he says, right next to the German 144 on English page 183, where he says, as a modal category of present state of hand, possibility signifies what is not yet actual and what is not at any time necessary. Yeah, but for anything to be present at hand as such, it is a possibility. Actuality is only a possibility. It's just the possibility that is as such, that we have access to. There are other possibilities not cashed out. So that's the problem with presence at hand ontology. It can understand the properties of this pen I'm holding in my hand, but that is not the same thing as understanding what makes Dave Dave, what makes Ken Ken, what makes Ahmed Ahmed. Or, to get more specific to the there, all of the collectivities that you participate in, what makes there, what it is. It's not properties, it's possibilities. It's not possibilities from the past that have become actual only, but specifically how those set you up to have singular, unique possibilities on your horizon, which is to say, in view going forward, how you're going to go forward. Going back to the room, the shovel, the weird shovel example, okay? You can bash people on the head with it, or you can hide it in the closet so it doesn't like make you look like a slob who doesn't put things away. In either of these cases, the shovel is not there as such. A scientist who comes into the room with a neutralized mood, who's just like, okay, there's a shovel, there's a couch, there's a television, there's some sketchy looking drug dealers. There's a girl who's wondering where her date is, right? Like the scientist isn't actually able to infer half of what I just said. He's not even use the word sketchy, right? He's just describing. And that shovel is just another thing among all the other things in the room. But depending on whether you're there for a drug deal or you're there for a date is going to change the referential, circumspective situation that lights up the possibilities of these things by freeing them into specific involvements. There's the involvement of the date, there's the involvement of the drug deal. All right. And every time I keep thinking about the drug deal, I keep going back to that scene from Euphoria where she gets introduced to fentanyl. And if you've not watched Euphoria, you just need to know that you got to get past the first episode. You got to go. You've not given it a chance if you don't watch the first 5 episodes. But at the point where she meets the scariest motherfucker alive, and that's the dude that's trying to get her hooked on fentanyl, he puts crazy pressure on her, and it's this big power trip that he pulls on the other guy in the room. It's fucked, man. And this is what I'm thinking about when I think of this situation, right? If you're in that situation, you should probably be thinking about the shovel. You should probably be thinking about what you need to do to defend yourself because this person's trying to kill you. All right. The entity which is essentially constituted by being in the world is itself in every case, it's there. We're beating a dead horse, but I just can't emphasize this enough. Dasein is the being of the between. We've done this. Dasein brings its there along with it. It lacks its there. It is not factically the entity which is essentially Dasein. Indeed, it is not this entity at all, if it lacks that there. All right. It is its disclosedness. Okay? It's always already in what? The there. But what is that there? Understanding discourse state of mind. For the first, half of the reading we did for this week, that there is primarily, he's saying, equiprimordially understanding and state of mind. But there's a decisive page where he then says, and discourse is equiprimordial to understanding and state of mind, which is kind of like a big moment. So pay attention to it. because the section you're all going to start next week on is the section on discourse and language. And then once that section is over, you'll get into section B of this chapter. And section B is where it gets like, okay, this is where he's going with it. It's going to get a lot more interesting right then. But let's go to page 185. I just want to read this right in the middle of the first paragraph of 185. On the contrary, any Dasein has, as Dasein, already projected itself, and as long as it is projecting. As long as it is, Dasein always has understood itself and always will understand itself in terms of possibilities. Remember, we're not using projecting the way psychology uses it today, okay? We're using projecting the way that you could say we project the Batman symbol over Gotham City by holding up the shape in front of the spotlight, right? But what we're projecting is what we're going to become. Now, in the case that you are building a table, like this person in the picture who's hammering the nail, that person is projecting a table. That's for the sake of which of their involvement at that moment, right? But what if you want to be the kind of person who can do a triathlon, a super intensive triathlon? You are now projecting yourself as a specific possibility. And it's going to stress you out, and you're going to feel intense pressure if you're not exercising every day to be ready for that triathlon by the deadline. I do have in mind, by the way, like some kind of future theory underground event that is going to involve skateboarding, slacklining, and like running. And then everybody has to prepare for like a year ahead of time. And then we're all going to do a bunch of sporting things. And then off to the side, we'll do some presentations. Yeah. But it's like, what kind of self are you projecting? Are you projecting the kind of self that is multilingual? Well, then what kind of daily things do you do to be that person? Are you projecting yourself as the kind of self who is tearing with the text, really reading it? Well, that's going to be stressful if you don't actually follow through and do the reading, isn't it? Shit. You're going to beat yourself up every day. You're going to be like, fuck, I'm not doing the things that I have to do to be the kind of person that I'm trying to project. You're trying to project that reality, right? And you can lazily project your reality and just call that your wish. I wish I was the kind of person who spoke multiple languages. And then you can will it and say, no, I actually go and I sit down and I look at a different language for a little while and I get confused by it because I know that in the long term, I have to do that if I want to be multilingual. No, I go on a jog and then I push myself on it and I go crazy sprint towards the end because ultimately I'm making myself into the kind of person who's going to be able to pull off this triathlon event, right? At the bottom of that paragraph, as projecting understanding is a kind of being of Dasein in which it is its possibilities as possibilities. There's no such thing as actuality for Heidegger. For Heidegger, what we tend to call actuality is just possibilities for which Dasein is. Of course, there is such a thing as actuality, but I'm just trying to say he's not thinking of actuality as being the most important thing, whereas possibility is this sort of ethereal, pure possibility thing. The way people talk about it, though, is that. You don't have to be an analytic philosopher to talk about it that way, because you say, oh, well, it's possible. I could have been president. It's possible. No, it's not fucking possible, dude. No, you couldn't have been not one of us in this fucking room could have been president of the United States, much less anywhere, right? Now you go, well, technically I could have been born into a different household. Okay, now we're not talking about you anymore. Now we're talking about this weird I placeholder that has nothing to do with you. Oh, well, I'm talking in the multiverse, there's the me that applied myself in school. There's the me that said no to all these other things and focused on this one thing, and then I became president. Dude, I mean, maybe, possibly, in this super expanded sense of the word possible, where it's like, yeah, unicorns are possible. Because guess what? I can imagine a possible world in which unicorns are real. Therefore, saying unicorns do not exist is not necessarily true, because I could think of possible worlds in which that statement's not true, right? Like, I'm sorry, what is this possibility we're talking about? Heidegger's talking about your possibilities, the possibilities you already are, which includes your not yet. Your not yet is you, in the same way that your missed opportunities are you, right? I missed this opportunity, I missed that opportunity, and I said hell no to this other set of possibilities. And that's who I am. I'm not just my positive characteristics and properties and actualized possibilities that you could put down on a piece of paper as a positivist and say, this is who Dave is. No, I'm also all of those ones I said no to, the ones I let pass by. Right? And that is why this is a powerful critique of positivism, of the tendency to say, well, we should only really be talking about that which is real, that which is actual, that which we see, right? That which we can describe as positively being there in front of us. But folks, at this point, you have to realize we are far removed from phenomenology. You do not see possibilities. Husserl and Brentano do not talk about seeing possibilities. When people call Heidegger a phenomenologist, it's almost like they didn't read him. He is a phenomenological hermeneuticist, or a hermeneutical phenomenologist. But he's not a phenomenologist. Hermeneutics is how he does his immanent critique of phenomenology. We're over here talking about possibilities right now, not that which just happens to present itself to consciousness as such, going off of purely what is described. Because Heidegger says to get back to the things themselves, like Husserl wants to do, we actually have to get to this point where we're actually talking about our possibilities. The there that he's been smuggling through the whole book so far is now the actual subject of the chapter, and here you find out we don't just understand the world cognitively, we understand the world modally. On 186, on the next page, we have to skip a lot of parts here, folks. But he's going to talk about our authentic understandings versus our inauthentic understandings. And then he'll talk about whether they can be genuine or not genuine. And I just want to say that gets really confusing because you're like, wait, wouldn't authenticity and genuineness be the same thing? And basically, I think what's going on here is that there's authentic possibilities versus inauthentic possibilities in the understanding. And then there's like a genuine way of going about that, right? The genuineness speaks to like how you seize the possibilities, but the possibilities can be your own most versus just whatever. Anybody else can actualize those ones. At the very top of that page, he says, only because the being of the there receives its constitution through understanding and through the character of understanding as projection, only because it is what it becomes, can it say to myself, or to itself, become what you are, and say this with understanding. When he gets into the call of conscience, you should actually write in the margin of the top of 186, call of conscience, and put it right there. And then be waiting, develop your anticipation for, in division 2, when he's going to tie the call of conscience into all of this. But the call of conscience is the thing that says, become what you are. We feel the ability that we could lose ourselves, and we also feel the ability that we could win ourselves. And that voice that says, become what you are, doesn't make any sense if you're a positivist. Doesn't make any sense if your empiricism is your metaphysics and your epistemology. It just doesn't make any sense. Traditional philosophy is fucked. And all we have to say about this slide before I turn from it is just projection is not something that you ever have a clean starting point to do. You can't just ever go, okay, I'm a blank slate. I'm about to choose what are my possibilities. I'm looking into the future. Okay, I'm going to project what I want to be. Schooling, mass industrialized schooling, does try to give you this kind of sense that there's like this pure you, this atomized I, and that it's looking at a set of projected possibilities that everybody who is your peers is also looking at. And you're all measured up against those possibilities by a ranking system that says that you're a better or a worse human being on the basis of the grades that you make in reference to those projections. But they're not necessarily your own most projections. Thronedness speaks to the fact that you find yourself always already in the midst of the distantiality just described. The distantiality being ranking yourself in reference to others and the idea of the normal and the idea of the normal's good, the their good, the they's good, das Mann's good, the das Mann's ideal. You always already find yourself thrown into that world with a big other, with a symbolic order, with language, with meaning, with a referential totality. You always already find yourself thrown, meaning that there's not a starting point from which to project. Meaning that you are, in your essence, thrown projection. You're thrown into the thick of it, and all your possibilities are sort of already set by the cards you've been dealt. That's how we find ourselves. At some point, it registers with you. Or you stay a kid forever. Right? We could develop from this a theory of the man-child. I know Anne is quite interested in developing a formalized theory of the man-child because there's something very weird about people who might be any age, but are man-children. And of course, nowadays with neoliberalism, women get to be man-children too, right? In fact, the ideal woman subject in neoliberalism is a man-child who's good at her job. But we're always already thrown into the world, and we're always existing through our possibilities via projection. I mean, just thinking about that will change your life forever. On this slide, which we cannot tarry with forever, but I did tell Anne she was going to read a quote, I think. I want to just unpack this one part. Anne, if you will just read, and by the way, Anne, of course, we're not going to be doing what I said we were doing today, between what we're doing now and what we're going to be doing later. I said we're going to go do some stuff, and we just have to do this. So if you would read the paragraph from page 180. Wait, no, someone else already read that. Nance already read that, I think. Where's the page I wanted you to read?
You were originally going to have me read something from like 178 or 179, like an hour ago.
Okay, 178, state of mind. So we've been focusing on projecting possibilities understandingly. Let's get into state of mind. Anne will read the quote from 178. It happens down here at the bottom. It's the second to last paragraph, or it's the final full paragraph. It's relatively short.
Okay. A state of mind not only discloses Dasein in its thrownness and its submission to that world which is already disclosed with its own being. It is itself the existential kind of being in which Dasein constantly surrenders itself to the world and lets the world matter to it in such a way that somehow Dasein evades its very self. The existential constitution of such evasion will become clear in the phenomenon of falling.
The phenomenon of falling will be what we get into next week. And it's fucking awesome if you're in the critical media theory class right now. It goes so well with all of this. And that's why I actually use it in chapter 2 of Waypoint, my first book. But for now, let's focus on, I had to burp just to kind of walk back like the reference to my own book. But let's go to think about what this means though. We tend to think that who a person is can be understood not just by like their properties, not just by their actualized possibilities. We also think that a person is what they like, what they focus on, and what they do. And Heidegger had said that Dasein is, in a sense, what it's doing. But that was when he was doing phenomenology. In this chapter, we're doing hermeneutics. So suddenly, the tables are turning, which is to say, you're not just what you're doing. In fact, at the moment that you think that you are most what you like and what you do, you might be least what you are. You are submitted to the world. You are in submission to the world. What does that mean? Except that being reveals itself to us as a burden. Now, if you are like Siddhartha, that is to say, young Buddha, pre-Buddha, if you are Siddhartha living in the king's castle, the prince, you are the prince of this realm, and your dad has done everything he could to hide suffering from you, to hide the burdensome nature of the world from you. And you have all the orgies and food and everything, all the entertainment you could ever possibly want. You have the most privilege anyone has ever had in the history of humanity. You are Solomon from the Old Testament. You are the lap of luxury, right? If that's you and that's your existence, you're probably going to still feel some kind of like ennui, some kind of, there's still something wrong with my existence. Pure pleasure pursuit is not truly satisfying. And so, of course, the story is that Siddhartha leaves the king's city, goes out into the world, and he sees his first dead person. He sees his first sick person. He sees his first. There's a series of escapades he goes on where he gets to see real life, and the real comes in to bust apart his reality, his symbolic and his imaginary. It's something he can't stomach. He can't live with it. Where his dad, the king, understands there's oppression, understands that there's suffering, but his dad, the king, is a realist and has learned to deal with it, but he wants to shelter his son from the horror and suffering and the burdensome nature of the world. Siddhartha eventually realizes, no, life is suffering. And then Buddhism is trying to come to terms with that fact, right? The Four Noble Truths are basically truths about suffering, the facticity of suffering, and what is the cause of suffering, which for Buddhism, it's desire itself. But I use this here as my example because this idea that we are in submission to the world is to say, outside of taking your own life in your own hands and exiting, you are always submitting to the world. Okay, my Bluetooth disconnected and then reconnected for no reason at all. And then it made it so you couldn't hear me. But anyway, the burdensome character is something that I would like to get a lot more into. I'm going to kind of rush it and just say that being does reveal itself as burdensome. And everyone knows this. If they've ever felt anxiety, if they've ever felt depression, if they've ever felt like they can't distract themselves and get out of their current mood. And that's exactly what Heidegger's getting to, is that Dasein's always in a state of evasion because the fundamental state of mind is something in relation to the burdensome character of existence. We're always projecting ourselves onto the horizon of possibilities in a way that helps us cope with that suffering and switch our mood up. Right? Because if you're in a bad mood, you're going to try to find a way to ultimately get through it and get out of it. Right? And he talks about how elation is a mood. Like what is elation? Except an indication of our temporary freedom from the burdensome character of our state of mind. Euphoria is another word like elation. Euphoria, going back to the TV show as the example, it's about heroin addiction. Primarily. It's kind of like the movie Kids from back in the day, except it's about Zoomers today, but it uses heroin and fentanyl as the thing that the protagonist is struggling with. And that euphoria, or the elation of a good joke, or of coming into circumference with someone else who's like, they get it in such a way so that you're both able to have a laugh about how fucked up the world is, right? The elation felt, or the euphoria felt, from either a good conversation, some good entertainment, or some good drugs, would not reveal itself as elation if it wasn't a relief. So what is it relieving us from? It's relieving us from the burdensome character of existence. I want to stress this because this is not something that you can phenomenologically derive. This is something that he is hermeneutically deriving. He's interpreting. He's saying, look, guys, we're always in moods. Okay? So what's the fundamental mood that we're always trying to counter? Well, taking elation as an indicator of something, we wouldn't feel this alleviation from suffering that feels so good, so pleasurable, if it wasn't for the fact that normal life is kind of fucking hard. It's a burden, right? So we're going to get into discourse next week. For right now, understanding is modal, state of mind is fundamentally having to do with the burdensome character of existence and how we flee from it through moods. And all of those moods, to get kind of charged and to become real for us, wouldn't be possible if our fundamental state of mind didn't already have the capacity for understanding possibilities this way. Because we're talking about these things equiprimordially, we understand the circumspective awareness of our situation via our fundamental state of mind that moves through different moods. There's the mood of alarm or threat because you're in the drug deal that might go bad. And there's the mood of the anticipation for a date and you're not sure if it's going to go well or not. In both of those situations, your mood is sort of reading the room circumspectively. And it's doing so understandingly. And it's doing so through state of mind. So meaning is constitutional. Like there's no meaning outside of Dasein. Meaning is constitutional. The clearing is the meaning space. And we pop up in that clearing. Always oriented, we are in the world. Always oriented. Infused with feelings. We are always structured by the symbolic. We are always perceiving, which is always projecting an interpretation. Okay? So I wish that he had said there is fundamental attunement versus modes of attunement. I wish that had been the translation, because it's basically what he's saying, and the translation is poor, because state of mind makes us think of something cognitive. State of mind is not what he has in mind. It's a poor translation. It should have been, instead of moods, it should have been mode of attunement, and instead of state of mind, it should have been fundamentally being attuned. We are always already being attuned, and then we do that through modes of attunement, which in our everyday discourse we call mood. I'm having a mood today. But the fact is that when you feel like you're not having a mood and people say, how are you doing? You're like, yeah. That's a mood too. And it's a way of coping with your fundamental state of mind. Also, any sort of modification of that is also a response to the fundamental situation. And science itself, as a search for meaning that Dasein undertakes, insofar as it wants to see everything present at hand, that is a mood. It's a neutral mood. He refers to it as tarrying alongside in earlier chapters, but he's calling that the sort of like you've neutralized yourself into a mood, but it's a specific mood. To be able to go through someone's carcass, looking at the parts of their body, as scientific objects, and not think about that person's life, requires a certain mood. In some cultures, it's illegal. There's a big ban put on, going inside of certain things, because in some cultures, some things are still sacred, right? Science usually gets going through health-related reasons because you've got people who are going through corpses, trying to figure out how the body works, right? And other people are like, that's where the soul is, don't do that, right? Well, that basic kind of worry of don't do that comes from the idea that, it kind of takes a psychopathic, sociopathic, sort of psychotic headspace to be in, to be able to always be analyzing things in this sort of cold, supposedly indifferent way, which is itself a mood. It's a way of coping. It's a way of reacting to your fundamental attunement, which he'll get into. I'm skipping a lot over that slide. You can always go back over it if you want to on your own. He uses fear as his example of how to do a sort of mood analysis, right? Fear is, generally speaking, bringing something threatening close in this sense of dissevering, right? Now, it's true. We are always under threat. Humans are always under threat. It's always true. Fear is always correct. Now, of course, you might think that there's a monster under the bed and there's not a monster under the bed, but your capacity to even think that there's a monster under the bed and feel terror is based in the fact that there are threats. If there weren't threats, we wouldn't have sometimes nightmares or a worry that there's someone in the closet, right? Maybe they have that shovel we put there earlier. Alarm is a way of fearing because something has come close suddenly. Dread is the exact same thing, except that that thing that has come close suddenly is actually unfamiliar. You don't know how to make sense of trench warfare because your traditional-minded sense of warfare didn't take it into account. Now you have nothing but pure dread because you're being thrown into the thick of trench warfare, right? And then that becomes terror. Terror is actually what you have in the trenches because it's sudden and unfamiliar. Dread is just when it's unfamiliar. Alarm is when it's just sudden, right? Terror is when it's both dread and alarm, right? Alarm plus dread equals terror. I love that section. And then other gradations include timidity, shyness, misgiving, becoming startled. But they're all based in our fundamental attunement to the world, and we are attuned as such so as to understand at a deep level, at the deepest level possible, the deepest level imaginable, we understand threat. We understand threat better than we understand anything else in the world. That is not to say that we have a clear interpretation of it, For instance, we could interpret the threat as the immigrant. We could interpret threat as the Trump lover. We could understand threat as climate change. These are all ways of understanding, and ways of understanding come through interpretation, right? But you're understanding possibilities on the basis of your fundamental attunement, and that fundamental attunement understands threat. It gets it, okay? And he says you can do this with other moods. You can trace them back. He doesn't do it. He's not here to give us a full psychology. That's not his goal. I wish he had, though. I would have liked to see him do it for love. Mikey reminded me last week, Marcuse's big critique, one of his big critiques of Heidegger, is that there's no love in being in time. I actually argue that it's kind of there. Love is kind of there because I'll say that for a different time when I'm doing housekeeping, when I feel like I have time. I don't feel like I have time right now to do everything I want to do and hang out and just talk about whatever I want to talk about. So, in service to the or in your interest of like getting on with your day, I just have to touch on the most important thing, which is the force structure, which was very confusing the first couple of times I read this. I feel like now I get it, and so I'm just going to go ahead and say we have to, at the bare minimum, read from this paragraph of page 191. This force structure is something he gets from Dilthey, and Dilthey got it from Schleiermacher. Okay? This is hermeneutics. He uses hermeneutics to eminently critique phenomenology. Phenomenology is how he gets out of the imaginary. And so when Lacanians tell me that he doesn't get out of the imaginary, I think that they just haven't really thought about what he does in this chapter. They haven't thought about how he says a lot of things very definitively earlier that now he's doing differently. He was saying Dasein is what it does. Now he's saying actually what Dasein keeps doing is evading what it actually is. Right? Hermeneutically, he's giving us a new interpretation. And he's doing so in a way that shows us that we are fundamentally the kind of creatures who interpret through having a forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. This is the threefold force structure that is always prior to all interpretations. Going back to the example of interpreting threat as the other, the immigrant, or is interpreting threat as the mega Trump-loving supporter. In either of those cases, you are interpreting threat. Threat is true. Now, the interpretation has a particular take on what that threat, that understanding is based in, and it tries to give it a sort of ideological framework for making sense of things. But that ideological framework is your foreconception. Your foreconception is your explanation of the threat. Your forehaving is your fundamental understanding of threat. And foresight is how you cherry pick everything in reference to your foreconception. You cherry pick from your understanding of the situation to your foreconception. And this is always prior to interpretation. It's indisputable, by the way. Obviously, in critical thinking classes, we're supposed to guard against our biases, and we're supposed to be aware of confirmation bias, and we're supposed to be aware that people cherry pick, and they have this selection bias to pick out for a pattern that they already have. Well, this is the structure of all that. First, we have a forehaving, which is our understanding of the possibilities of the situation. Now, that's vague, but we understand threat. We understand it. Then we have foresight, picking out specific kinds of things that seem threatening. And then we interpret those things with an eye to our foreconcept. And our foreconcept is how we conceptualize things. It's how we make things present at hand. It's how we make things communicatable through discourse. And that foreconception, that's where we get into ideology. Heidegger never uses the word, but where he talks about foreconception, well, guess what, everybody? You've all got foreconceptions, and they're ideological. And you can't really ever get outside of that stuff without going through critique of those things, right? And it's hard. It's hard to. So I've got a bunch of examples of the force structure at work. I know Anne asked me to give some examples of the force structure at work. And so I've got a bunch of different people touching different things, like one person's touching a tree, one person's touching a swing, one person's touching a bush, one person's touching a wall, and they're all saying, it's an elephant. Right? That's the critique of this idea that, well, when we're all talking about something and we're not making sense, maybe we're all talking about the same thing. Yeah, well, maybe you're also just confirming whatever your foreconception is. And now I've got examples here, but first I'm going to read the quote. Whenever something is interpreted as something, the interpretation will be founded essentially upon forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. Okay, examples. Believing that everything is meant to be. That's a foreconception. Believing everything is accidental. That's a foreconception. Believing someone is fundamentally a good person. That's a foreconception. Believing someone is an evil, scheming bastard. That's a foreconception. That's a foreconception. You're going to cherry pick from their actions and from the stories you've heard about them, and you're going to use those to confirm your foreconception. But all of those things are based in your forehaving. And your forehaving is what? The fact that there are such a thing as evil, scheming bastards, right? You have this sense for threat. You have this sense for evil people. You have that fundamental sense for that possibility, and that's been quilted and woven together into this picture by this ideology or by this story, this narrative someone's telling you about this person. Other examples are believing that poverty is primarily caused by racism, believing that poverty is primarily caused by failure to be responsible, believing that poverty is primarily caused by a failure to be responsible. I already said that. Believing that Heidegger is a radical individualist like Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Sartre, rather than their most profound critic. That's a foreconception that if you have going into this text, you will go ahead and read everything. Your foresight will be in reference to that foreconception. That foresight is always in reference to that foreconception. All right. The example of, this is just assertion. I'm going to make this part really quick here, but basically, assertion snatches up significance as present at hand. Assertion is judgment. It's propositional logic. It's statements of matters of fact. Okay? Assertion, as he's interpreting assertion as downstream from the force structure of interpretation. He says that the ready to hand is lit up by mood, and that articulation borrows from the stock of significations ready to hand, and I'm saying in scripts, right? We talk about how people kind of just grab some kind of like, oh, people say this, and so kind of use it in this tropish way to explain something, right? You're just grabbing some script for dealing with the thing. The script is ready to hand for explaining the situation, but that articulation is based in an understanding. That articulation is based in an interpretation. That interpretation is based in your fundamental understanding. But that interpretation is some narrative that piggybacks atop your fundamental understanding, which is like to say, you fundamentally understand the idea of threat. 2-year-olds understand the idea of threat. That's why you can scare them. I mean, babies, when they cry in the middle of the night, it sounds like the worst wailing you'll ever hear. And it's like sometimes you can't even comfort them. You cannot even console them. They are in the abyss, right? They're in the abyss, and they're going through something harder than you have to go through, right? And they're going through something that we all had to go through, right? Which is understanding threat, understanding the burdensome nature of existence. That's prior to all interpretation. That's prior to all philosophy. And Descartes wants to act like he just popped into existence and did the meditations like some fucking atom in the void. It's like some kind of a brain in the vat. Like some kind of a mind with no real subjectivization that has submitted him into throne projection in the world, right? But all philosophers do that. Everybody does that. And of course, I've got a picture here of a couple of Avengers trying to lift Thor's hammer. And the point is that when you say that the hammer is too heavy, that is an assertion. You've made that into a present at hand assertion. Now, sometimes that assertion might be correct, sometimes that assertion might be incorrect, but it's only correct or incorrect insofar as it's able to adequately describe your actual involvement in making the table, right? And all present at hand assertions originate from a context of ready to hand involvements. They get cherry picked out of it, usually with some foreconception, with an eye to some foreconception. All right, so this is it. I basically have done the lecture. I said that there's a big question towards the end. I'll tie it into Lacan, and here we go. The question: does any of this seem like it is strictly relegated to the imaginary? Remember that with Lacan, the imaginary is what is perceptible in your imagination or through what philosophers call intuition, but it's like what you actually see, what you actually describe. So when Brian Becker came on a month and a half ago and told me, when I asked him, he said, no, Heidegger does stay in the imaginary. I am convinced that he's not really registered this chapter. And I was already suspicious of it, and I feel like very confident now in saying, no, he doesn't. So the circle that somebody has to square is on the screen here. We've got the imaginary, real, and symbolic in the Bohemian knot for Lacan. And then we've got understanding, state of mind, and discourse outside of that and around that, right? So I think that both could be used. You could be a philosopher who relies on both of these models, but they don't just collapse into one another. It's not like the understanding belongs in the imaginary, state of mind belongs in the real, and discourse belongs in the symbolic. Though, of course, you could argue that they do, because you could say we understand the real at an unconscious level. We see things lit up by our mood. And the symbolic is language. The fact that Lacan does basically match up to this trifecta that Heidegger develops as equiprimordial means Lacanians have to fucking square this circle, not me. Lacanians do, not me. But I feel like I'm over here pointing at plagiarism. That's what I feel like I'm doing. I'm just saying, guys, Lacanians, you gotta square the circle here. For Lacan, he's fine. He's a Heideggerian. He never really stops being a Heideggerian, in my opinion. Of course, he doesn't want to deal with Leclerc and his Dasein. And of course, he doesn't want to deal with Heideggerians in France. And of course, he wants to do things the way he wants to do things. And he's going to dress it up in his own language. But you can't tell me Lacan didn't read this and take it very seriously. All right. So I think it's great. I think that the two can be kind of squared. I don't know how to do it just yet. I want you to keep your eye towards it. If none of you have studied Lacan, you don't even have to worry about it. But for the rest of us, it's a real problem. And the fact is, there's two kinds of people on the internet and philosophy circles today. They're Deleuzians and Lacanians. And the fact is, I'll take the side of the Lacanians at a certain level, but those Lacanians, without a basis in Heidegger, are LARPing. They're fucked. They don't even know what they're talking about because they haven't been through the deconstruction of modernity that gets us to this point that actually lays the basis for Lacan to even make sense. Okay? So I say, can anyone read this chapter and seriously remain convinced that Heidegger is stuck in the realm of perceptions and reflections? Are you kidding me? Do we see you're not yet? Do we see threat? You do not see these things. They're not objects of phenomenological method. They're objects of hermeneutics. I think that the much more radical reading, I'm borrowing slightly from something Mikey said a long time ago in a personal conversation, but I think the more radical reading is that Lacan is also a phenomenological hermeneuticist. He just takes that into the clinic and applies it into the clinical relation between analyst and analysand. He is partially doing a phenomenology of his analysands, and he's partially doing a hermeneutics. Yeah. And I think that his entire semiotics has to use the structure of signification that Heidegger develops, because master signifiers don't make any sense outside of reference to the for the sake of which that structures everything for us. I say if Lacan wasn't an idiot, then he knew Heidegger was a critique of phenomenology. Now, I suddenly feel stupid or like embarrassed. I shouldn't have, because now that I've said things in the way that I've said things, that's going to reflect on Brian Becker. We have to remember that the scholars in the field who might say that Heidegger stays in the imaginary are reading him through a specific lens with a specific foreconception. I don't think that they're idiots. Hubert Dreyfus is not an idiot for doing this radical individualist reading of Heidegger. That's not an idiot thing. We all have foreconceptions. And if you're primarily based in Lacan, and then you understand Heidegger as a spin-off of Husserl, and you've read a lot of Husserl too, chances are you've set yourself up to read him this way. If you've read a lot of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Sartre and Camus, and then you read Heidegger, you're really setting yourself up to read him this way. That's your foreconception. Everything you read from the text is being selected with an eye, foresight, to that foreconception, right? Anyway, I say someone should try to square this circle. The picture is a picture of Heidegger, somebody, Lacan, somebody, Heidegger's wife, and then Lacan's wife. Rumor has it there was some, I think Lacan and Heidegger's wife had an affair. But, Heidegger was having affairs on poor Ygritte or whatever her name was all the time. And it actually, Heidegger's big mental collapse in like 1945 or 46 was partially because of the denazification committee putting him on trial and them not really believing him for a while that he had been as neutral as he was trying to make himself out to be. And on the other side, Ygritte discovering that he had been in an affair. And so maybe she tries to get her revenge by banging Lacan. And of course, Lacan's killing his symbolic daddy by getting with the love of his life, supposedly. But I think back then, people didn't marry the love of their life. I think back then, marriage was a responsibility. And so I think cheating was also kind of just like expected for that generation. Everybody, when you read these people's biographies, that was just ubiquitous. Nobody was like thinking about love as a truth event, as something that you're in fidelity to, that you chose as a radical choice in the kind of way that we're talking about choices here. But here I've got a picture of Lacan and Heidegger and his wife. Look at her looking at Lacan. She's like, oh yeah. And Heidegger's like, I kind of want to watch you guys. Can I hide in the closet? Oh my gosh.
Tight, yeah! Blue, yellow, pink, whatever, man. Just keep bringing me that.
Just keep bringing me that, whatever. Housekeeping, we'll get to it next time. There's the whole thing about double quotes I want to get into. I wanted to do we did do the bonus assignment. I already said the thing about the juicy stuff and the question. Actually, you know what? We already hit on everything. The question as to collective or individual Dasein. Nance caught a really important passage. Nance, can you post that as its own standalone post and give it your interpretation of why you think it substantiates my collective Dasein interpretation, which is now our collective Dasein interpretation, because it's on the table and we're operating with both interpretations. All right. And by keeping both interpretations in sight, we do not just have one foreconception that we're cherry picking everything towards. We're actually able to keep two foreconceptions that we have foresight towards. And so we're always kind of looking at both as we read now, which means that we've all gotten a little bit of distance from this text always overwhelming us as just a transparently obvious interpretation. Because ultimately, if there's anything that you should be taking from all of this, it is just that there's no such thing as a neutral standpoint from which to interpret. We're always already in the interpretive circle, and that's okay. Heidegger, that's not a problem. For most philosophers, they are vexed. Oh no, what will we do? Clutching our pearls. Heidegger goes, yeah, Fucking bitch, get with it. It's called existence. Grow up. And not just its existence, grow up, but also how we enter the circle, the hermeneutic circle. We're always already in it, but we're also always already entering it. Now, we're always projecting ourselves, and we always bring interpretation with us. But we can develop skills and tools and a method for navigating the circle so that we actually have some kind of a ground beneath our feet, as opposed to people who are just fucking spiraling in the they, which is going to be the whole next half of this chapter after you finish the next short section. So the next short section is where you all get to see this part, the discourse part in the middle with the question marks over it. Okay, you're going to have to get a sense for what that means and how that revolutionizes what we were already talking about with the equiprimordiality of understanding and state of mind. Okay, but once you've gotten through that section, it's into the they. Ambiguity, idle talk, and curiosity. Oh my God. Couldn't be more excited to share that with you all. And that's a wrap. We did the lecture. We've made it through week 6. We've made it through half of chapter 5. Be advised, this next week's reading is light, comparatively. This next week's reading is light, comparatively. But the following week, we're doing 50 plus pages in 1 week. And then Ann and I are going to go get married. And so, yeah, that's our facticity. But if I were you, I'd try to cheat and go ahead a little bit. If I were you, I'd use the fact that this is a very light week and get ahead into chapter 6. In my ideal world, I myself will go through at least half of chapter 6 this week. Though the lecture will be mostly focused on the fucking awesome way in which the structure that he's just set up for us actually, how it plays out at the level of everydayness. Cool. I have to leave right now. I have to cut this off. And so everybody, thank you so much for participating. I hope you come to office hours and bring questions from this week after you've had a little bit of time to reflect on it. So in that case, I hope to see you on Tuesday, the 11th of July, 2023. And if not, look to where office hours are posted in the future. Hopefully there should be a place where office hours are posted in the future if you're watching this in the future. Definitely find a way to get office hours with me. And if my office hours do not work for you, then let me know a window of time that works on the same day as those office hours, and I'll fit you in on that same day. Don't worry. It'll happen. All right. Just let me know what works for you. Take care. Bye-bye.